Dawn light crept across the English Channel on the morning of June 6, 1944, revealing thousands of ships cutting through rough grey water toward the coast of France. This was the entire Battle of Normandy timeline, the largest amphibious invasion in military history and one of the most consequential campaigns of the Second World War. For nearly 3 months, from June through August 1944, over 2 million Allied soldiers would fight through hedgerows, villages, and open fields to break German control of Western Europe. The story begins in the years of occupation, when German engineers fortified the Norman coastline with concrete and steel. It moves through the planning rooms of London and Washington, the deception operations that confuse the enemy, and the brutal landings on 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. What follows is a complete account of how this campaign unfolded. How did ordinary men overcome such extraordinary defenses? The summer of 1940 brought defeat to France in just 6 weeks. German armored columns had swept through the Ardennes, bypassed the Maginot Line, and forced the British Expeditionary Force to evacuate from Dunkirk. By late June, France had signed an armistice, and the swastika flew over Paris. For the people of Normandy, this meant occupation. German soldiers arrived in the coastal towns, Cherbourg, Caen, Bayeux, and dozens of smaller villages. Curfews were imposed. Ration cards became the currency of survival. Local administrators took orders from the new military government, and the rhythm of Norman life bent under the weight of foreign rule. The beaches that would later become famous, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, were simply stretches of sand and stone in those early years. Fishermen still launched their boats at dawn. Farmers tended orchards in the bocage, the dense hedgerow country that defined inland Normandy. But the Germans saw these beaches differently. They saw potential invasion routes. And so, even before the first bunker was poured, military planners began surveying the coastline. In 1942, the construction accelerated. Hitler, increasingly concerned about a cross-channel attack, ordered the creation of the Atlantic Wall. The Atlantic Wall, a defensive barrier stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. Thousands of kilometers of coastline would be fortified with concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles. The work was immense. Organization TOT, the German military engineering group, conscripted laborers from across occupied Europe, French civilians, prisoners of war, and forced workers, mixed concrete, laid rebar, and hauled materials under the supervision of German engineers. By late 1943, roughly 600 kilometers of the Norman coast alone had been incorporated into this defensive system. The Tobruk bunker became a common sight along the shore. Named after similar emplacements used in North Africa, these small concrete pits housed machine guns or mortars, their low profiles making them difficult to spot from the sea. Larger casemates housed artillery pieces, some with 88mm guns capable of destroying tanks or landing craft at considerable range. Minefields spread across the beaches, buried beneath the sand. Wooden stakes, topped with telemines, jutted from the tidal flats, designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft at high tide. Steel hedgehogs and Czech hedgehogs, crosses of welded rails, littered the shallows, ready to block any vessel that approached. Behind the beaches, the Germans positioned their infantry divisions. The 7th Army, part of Army Group B, held the Norman sector. These were not elite units. Many soldiers were older men, veterans of the Eastern Front recovering from wounds, or troops from non-German territories pressed into service. They manned the bunkers, patrolled the cliffs, and waited. The war felt distant here. The Eastern Front consumed most of Germany's military strength. Normandy was a quiet sector, or so it seemed. For the French civilians, life under occupation was a negotiation of survival and resistance. Some collaborated openly, finding advantage in the new order. Others resisted quietly, hiding downed Allied airmen, passing information to underground networks, or simply enduring with silent defiance. The black market flourished. Coffee was scarce, Butter and meat disappeared into German supply chains. Children grew up knowing that certain words could not be spoken aloud, that certain songs could not be sung. In November 1943, Hitler issued Directive Number 51. This document shifted the strategic focus of the Third Reich. The Eastern Front, for all its ferocity, would receive no more reinforcements. The West now demanded attention. Intelligence reports suggested that the Allies were preparing a major operation. The question was where. Pas-de-Calais, with its proximity to Britain, seemed the logical choice. But the Norman coast could not be ignored. Directive Number 51 ordered the strengthening of defenses in the West, the reinforcement of divisions, and the preparation for an invasion that might come at any moment. As 1943 drew to a close, Normandy was no longer just an occupied province. It was a potential battlefield. The bunkers stood ready, the mines were buried, the soldiers waited, and across the Channel, in the camps and ports of southern England, another army was assembling, preparing to challenge the steel and concrete of the Atlantic Wall with blood and determination. The fields lay quiet under winter skies, but beneath that silence, history was gathering force. The decision to invade Western Europe did not emerge from a single meeting or a single mind. It was forged through months of debate, compromise, and strategic calculation among the leaders of the United States and Great Britain. The path to overlord wound through conference rooms in Washington, London, Casablanca, Quebec, and Tehran. At each stop, the stakes grew higher, and the commitment became more concrete. In January 1942, just weeks after the United States entered the war following Pearl Harbor, American and British military planners met in Washington. The atmosphere was tense. The Japanese were sweeping through the Pacific. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking Allied shipping at alarming rates. The Soviet Union, bearing the brunt of the German onslaught on the Eastern Front, demanded relief. Stalin wanted a second front, an Allied invasion of Western Europe that would force Germany to divide its forces. American planners, led by General George C. Marshall, favored a direct approach. They proposed an early cross-channel invasion, possibly as soon as 1942 or 1943. The plan, codenamed Operation Roundup, envisioned a massive assault on the French coast, striking at the heart of German-occupied Europe. Marshall believed that only a direct confrontation in France could bring the war to a swift conclusion. The British were more cautious. Winston Churchill and his military advisors remembered the slaughter of the First World War, the trenches of the Somme, the futile charges against entrenched positions. They had also experienced recent defeats: Dunkirk, Greece, Crete. They argued that the Allies were not yet strong enough for a major invasion. The necessary landing craft did not exist in sufficient numbers. The American army, though growing rapidly, lacked combat experience. A premature invasion could end in disaster. Instead, the British proposed a peripheral strategy. Rather than striking directly at France, they advocated for operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean. These campaigns would weaken German forces, secure vital shipping lanes, and knock Italy out of the war. They would buy time for the Allies to build strength. The debate continued through 1942. In November of that year, Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, commenced. American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, beginning a campaign that would eventually drive Axis forces from the African continent. The peripheral strategy had won, at least temporarily, but the question of a cross-channel invasion did not disappear. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill met to plan the next phase of the war. The grand setting, a Moroccan resort surrounded by palm trees and armed guards, contrasted with the gravity of the discussions. Here, the leaders agreed to demand unconditional surrender from Germany, Italy, and Japan. They also approved the invasion of Sicily, continuing the Mediterranean strategy. Yet, even at Casablanca, the seed of overlord was planted. The conference established a planning staff for the eventual invasion of France. General Frederick Morgan was appointed Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, a position known by its acronym, COSAC. Morgan's task was immense. He had to plan an invasion without knowing who would command it, how many troops would be available, or exactly when it would occur. But the work began. Maps were studied, beaches were analyzed, logistics were calculated. Through the spring and summer of 1943, Morgan's staff labored in London. They examined the French coastline, considering every possible landing site. Pas-de-Calais offered the shortest crossing, but was heavily defended. Brittany was too far from the ultimate objective, Germany itself. The Norman coast emerged as the best option. It had suitable beaches, was within range of Allied fighter aircraft based in England, and lay close to the vital port of Cherbourg. In August 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill met again at Quebec for the Quadrant Conference. The Allied victories in North Africa and Sicily had strengthened the case for invasion. The conference approved the Cossack Plan in principle. The target date was set for May 1944. The operation would be called Overlord. But the most crucial commitment came in November 1943, at the Tehran Conference. For the first time, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met together. The Soviet leader had long demanded the Second Front. Now, he pressed his case directly. The Eastern Front had bled the Red Army white. Millions of Soviet soldiers had died. Stalin wanted assurance that the Western Allies would finally strike at Germany from the West. Roosevelt and Churchill gave that assurance. Overlord would proceed in May 1944. The invasion would coincide with a major Soviet offensive on the Eastern Front, crushing Germany in a vice from both directions. Stalin was satisfied. The alliance was cemented. In December 1943, the final piece fell into place. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Eisenhower, an American officer who had commanded the North African and Italian campaigns, would lead Overlord. His appointment reflected the growing dominance of American resources in the alliance. The United States was now the arsenal of democracy, producing ships, aircraft, tanks, and equipment at a scale that dwarfed all other combatants. Eisenhower immediately reviewed the Cossack Plan. He found it too limited. The initial proposal called for landings on 3 beaches with 3 divisions. Eisenhower wanted 5 beaches and 5 divisions, plus 3 airborne divisions to secure the flanks. The expanded plan required more landing craft, more ships, more men. The invasion date was pushed back to June to allow time for additional preparations. By early 1944, the Allied commitment was total. The decision that had been debated for 2 years was now irrevocable. Millions of tons of supplies were crossing the Atlantic. Hundreds of thousands of troops were training in Britain. The greatest military operation in history was taking shape. The conference tables were cleared. The maps were rolled. The time for planning was ending. The time for action was approaching. By the winter of 1943, Britain had become an armed camp. American servicemen joked that the island would sink under the weight of all the equipment being stockpiled. It was an exaggeration, but barely. From the Scottish Highlands to the southern coast, every available space was filled with troops, vehicles, aircraft, and supplies. The transformation of Britain into a staging ground for Overlord was one of the greatest logistical achievements in military history. The numbers were staggering. By June 1944, approximately 1.5 million American soldiers were stationed in Britain, along with hundreds of thousands of British, Canadian, Polish, French, and other Allied troops. The total invasion force would exceed 2 million men. Housing this army required the construction of hundreds of camps, the requisition of thousands of buildings, and the cooperation of a civilian population already weary from years of war. The ports of southern England became the arteries of the invasion. Southampton, Portsmouth, Plymouth, and dozens of smaller harbors buzzed with activity. Liberty ships, mass-produced American cargo vessels, arrived daily, disgorging trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, and ammunition. Cranes swung ceaselessly, lifting crates from holds and depositing them on docks already crowded with materiel. The British railway system, strained to its limits, transported supplies inland to depots scattered across the countryside. Among the most remarkable preparations were the Mulberry harbors. Allied planners knew that capturing a major port quickly was unlikely. German demolitions would render any captured harbor unusable for weeks or months. The solution was to bring their own harbors. 2 artificial ports would be constructed from massive concrete caissons called Phoenix units. These hollow structures, some as large as 5-story buildings, were built in British dockyards throughout early 1944. Once towed across the channel and sunk in position, they would form breakwaters protecting floating piers and roadways. The engineering was audacious. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. Another logistical marvel was Pluto pipeline under the ocean. Fuel consumption for the invasion force would be enormous. Tankers could supply initial needs, but a more permanent solution was required. Pluto was a system of undersea pipelines that would pump fuel directly from Britain to the French coast. The pipes were wound onto massive drums called conundrums, which would be unspooled across the channel floor after the beaches were secured. Training consumed the spring of 1944. Every unit rehearsed its role in the invasion. Infantry divisions practiced amphibious landings on British beaches that resembled their Norman objectives. At Slapton Sands in Devon, American troops conducted full-scale exercises with live ammunition. One such exercise, Operation Tiger, in late April, ended in tragedy when German E-boats attacked the training convoy, killing over 700 American servicemen. The disaster was kept secret to preserve operational security, but it underscored the dangers that awaited. Armored units drilled in the countryside, their tanks churning through fields and villages. Specialized vehicles developed for the invasion known as Hobart's Funnies, after their designer, Major General Percy Hobart, were tested and refined. These included tanks equipped with flails for clearing mines, tanks that could swim using flotation screens, and tanks that carried bundles of logs to fill anti-tank ditches. The British had learned hard lessons from failed raids, particularly the disastrous Dieppe raid of 1942, where Canadian forces suffered devastating casualties, attacking a fortified port. Those lessons shaped the specialized equipment now being prepared. Airborne units trained with particular intensity. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions of the U.S. Army, along with the British 6th Airborne Division, would drop behind the invasion beaches to secure key bridges and disrupt German communications. Paratroopers jumped repeatedly from C-47 transport aircraft, learning to exit quickly and assemble in darkness. Glider pilots practiced landing their fragile craft in confined spaces, knowing that their passengers, infantrymen, and equipment would need to be combat-ready immediately upon touching down. The air campaign supporting Overlord was already underway. The transportation plan, championed by Eisenhower's deputy, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, targeted French railways and bridges. The objective was to isolate Normandy, making it difficult for the Germans to reinforce the area once the invasion began. Heavy bombers that had been pounding German cities were diverted to strike rail yards, marshalling areas, and key bridges. Fighter bombers strafed locomotives and rolling stock. By June, the French railway system was severely degraded. Naval preparations were equally extensive. The invasion fleet would comprise over 5,000 ships and landing craft, the largest armada ever assembled. Battleships and cruisers would provide bombardment support. Destroyers would screen the fleet against submarines and surface threats. Minesweepers would clear channels through German minefields, and the landing craft themselves, LSTs, LCIs, LCVPs, would carry the assault troops to shore. Security was paramount. The Germans knew that an invasion was coming. The question was when and where. Maintaining secrecy about the actual date and location was critical. Troops were confined to their camps in the weeks before the invasion, unable to communicate with the outside world. Coded messages replaced plain speech. Even the highest-ranking officers knew only what was necessary for their role. The pressure on Eisenhower and his staff was immense. Every day brought new challenges: equipment shortages, training accidents, coordination problems among the various national forces. The Supreme Commander, bore the weight of knowing that millions of lives depended on decisions being made in these final weeks. He visited troops constantly, speaking with soldiers, boosting morale, and observing preparations. The men needed to see their commander, to know that he understood the risks they would face. As May turned to June, the camps filled to capacity. Soldiers wrote letters home, knowing they might be their last. Chaplains held services for crowded congregations. Equipment was waterproofed and loaded. Maps and photographs of the invasion beaches were distributed to unit commanders. The machinery of invasion was primed and ready. Across the Channel, the German defenders maintained their vigil. They knew the blow would come. They simply did not know when or where. The waiting tested nerves on both sides. But in the harbours and airfields of southern England, the question was no longer if, but when. The island held its breath. The army was ready. History was about to be made. War is not only fought with bullets and bombs, it is also fought with illusions. In the months before D-Day, the Allies waged a campaign of deception so elaborate and effective that it shaped the entire course of the Normandy invasion. This campaign, codenamed Operation Bodyguard, aimed to confuse the German High Command about the true location and timing of the cross-channel assault. Its most important component was Operation Fortitude, and its success would prove as valuable as any division of troops. The strategic problem was clear. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. Allied preparations were too massive to hide completely. Aerial reconnaissance, intelligence reports, and simple logic told German commanders that the blow would fall somewhere on the French coast in 1944. The challenge for the Allies was not to hide the invasion entirely, but to make the Germans uncertain about where the main effort would occur. Fortitude was divided into two parts. Fortitude, North, aimed to convince the Germans that an invasion of Norway was planned, tying down German divisions in Scandinavia. Fortitude South, the more critical operation, sought to persuade the Germans that the main invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The reasoning was sound. Pas-de-Calais offered the shortest crossing from Britain to France. It was closer to Germany and the Ruhr industrial heartland. From a purely logical standpoint, it seemed the obvious choice. To sell this deception, the Allies created a phantom army. The first United States Army group, known as FUSAG, existed primarily on paper and in radio transmissions. Its commander was Lieutenant General George S. Patton, the famous and flamboyant American tank general. The Germans respected Patton. They believed he would lead the main invasion force. By placing him in command of FUSAG, the Allies reinforced the notion that the real invasion was yet to come, even after troops landed in Normandy. The deception extended beyond paperwork. In southeastern England, opposite Pas-de-Calais, the Allies constructed elaborate decoys, inflatable tanks made of rubber, complete with painted markings and realistic shadows, filled fields where German reconnaissance aircraft might photograph them. Dummy landing craft floated in harbors. Fake artillery pieces pointed toward the Channel. From the air, these decoys appeared genuine. German photo interpreters, studying the images, reported massive concentrations of equipment and troops preparing for an assault on Calais. Radio traffic completed the illusion. Signal units transmitted a constant stream of messages using FUSAG's call signs. Orders were issued, acknowledgements sent, and routine communications maintained all of it fake. German radio intercept stations, monitoring Allied frequencies, picked up these transmissions and reported them to their superiors. The picture that emerged was of a powerful army group preparing for action. The double-cross system added another layer of deception. British intelligence had captured or turned nearly every German spy operating in Britain. These double agents, now working for the Allies, fed carefully crafted misinformation back to their German handlers. They reported on troop movements, equipment concentrations, and invasion preparations, all pointing to Pas-de-Calais. The Germans, trusting their agents, incorporated this false intelligence into their assessments. One of the most effective double agents was a Spaniard codenamed Garbo by the British, known to the Germans as Arabelle. Operating from Britain, Garbo controlled a network of fictional sub-agents, each providing pieces of the larger deception. His reports were detailed, plausible, and strategically valuable to the Germans. So trusted was Garbo that the Germans awarded him the Iron Cross for his services even as he worked to deceive them. The deception's impact on German planning was profound. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, believed that Pas-de-Calais was the likely invasion site. His subordinate, Rommel, was less certain, but still divided his attention between Normandy and Calais. Most critically, several powerful German armored divisions were positioned near Calais, held in reserve to counter the expected main assault. These divisions included some of Germany's best tanks and most experienced crews. Hitler himself was convinced that Pas-de-Calais was the primary target. His interference in military decisions, always a factor in German operations, meant that his conviction carried strategic weight. Even after the Normandy landings began, Hitler refused to release the armored reserves near Calais, believing that Normandy was a feint and the real invasion would follow at Pas-de-Calais. This belief persisted for weeks, crippling the German response to the actual invasion. The brilliance of fortitude lay not only in its creation, but in its maintenance. After D-Day, the deception continued. Fusag remained active, its fake communications suggesting that an even larger force was preparing to strike. German intelligence, analyzing the situation, concluded that the Normandy landings involved only a portion of Allied strength. The bulk of the invasion force, they believed, was still in England, waiting to launch the main assault against Calais. This miscalculation cost the Germans dearly. Divisions that could have reinforced Normandy remained in place, guarding against an attack that would never come. The 15th Army, one of Germany's strongest formations in France, stayed rooted near Pas-de-Calais, while the 7th Army fought desperately in Normandy. By the time the Germans realized the true nature of the Allied plan, the beachhead was firmly established. Fortitude demonstrated that intelligence and deception could be as decisive as combat. The inflatable tanks and fake radio messages cost a fraction of what real equipment would have required, yet they achieved results that thousands of soldiers and hundreds of tanks might not have accomplished. They bought time, created confusion, and divided the enemy's strength at the most critical moment. The Phantom Army never fired a shot, but it won battles nonetheless. Knowledge is the foundation of planning. Before a single soldier could land on the beaches of Normandy, Allied planners needed to understand every detail of the German defenses. This understanding came from two primary sources: aerial reconnaissance and the French resistance. Together, they provided the intelligence that shaped Overlord. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces flew thousands of reconnaissance missions over France in 1943 and 1944. High-altitude aircraft, equipped with precision cameras, photographed the entire Norman coastline repeatedly. Photo interpreters at bases in Britain studied the images with magnifying glasses, identifying bunkers, gun emplacements, trenches, minefields, and obstacles. Every change was noted. When the Germans added new fortifications or moved troops, the photographs revealed it. The detail was remarkable. Individual buildings in Norman villages were catalogued. Beach gradients were calculated from shadow measurements. The exact positions of anti-tank obstacles were mapped. This information was compiled into sand table models that unit commanders studied before the invasion. Soldiers heading for Omaha Beach could view a three-dimensional replica showing the bluffs, the draws leading inland, and the positions of German strongpoints. Low-level missions added further detail. Fighter aircraft screamed across the coastline at wave-top height, their cameras capturing images that high-altitude photography might miss. These missions were dangerous. German anti-aircraft guns were deadly accurate, but the pilots pressed on, knowing that every photograph might save lives on the invasion beaches. Commando raids provided ground-level intelligence. Small teams of soldiers, often specialists from combined operations, landed secretly on Norman beaches at night. They collected sand samples to determine whether the beaches could support heavy vehicles. They measured the height of sea walls. They probed German defenses, testing their alertness and response times. These raids were brief and stealthy. The commandos withdrew before dawn, carrying their intelligence back to England. One such operation, codenamed Tarbrush, sent teams to examine specific beach obstacles. The men paddled ashore in inflatable boats, crawled across minefields, and returned with crucial data about the metal hedgehogs and wooden stakes that littered the tidal zones. Their reports influenced the design of the specialized tanks and demolition teams that would clear paths for the assault waves. The French resistance provided intelligence that no aircraft or commando could obtain. Throughout occupied France, networks of ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, railway workers, telephone operators, gathered information and transmitted it to London. In Normandy, these networks were particularly active. Resistance members counted German troops moving through villages. They noted the markings on vehicles, identifying units. They reported the locations of ammunition dumps, fuel depots, and headquarters. The risks were enormous. German counterintelligence, particularly the Gestapo, hunted resistance networks ruthlessly. Capture meant torture and execution. Entire families were arrested and shot for suspected collaboration with the Allies. Yet the information continued to flow. Coded radio transmissions, carried by operators hiding in attics and basements, reached London daily. One critical contribution from the resistance was intelligence about the German order of battle. Knowing which divisions defended Normandy, their strength, and their equipment allowed Allied planners to assess the opposition they would face. When the Germans moved the 352nd Infantry Division to reinforce the area behind Omaha Beach in late May 1944, resistance sources reported the change. Unfortunately, this intelligence arrived too late to alter plans significantly, and the strengthened defenses at Omaha would exact a heavy toll on D-Day. Sabotage plans were coordinated between London and the resistance. In the weeks before the invasion, specific targets were identified: railway lines, telephone exchanges, bridges that German reinforcements would need. The resistance would strike on cue, activated by coded messages broadcast over the BBC. "The dice are on the table," or "John has a long moustache." These nonsensical phrases, embedded in regular broadcasts, were signals to specific networks to execute their missions. The BBC messages also served a psychological purpose. German intelligence monitored these broadcasts, knowing they contained coded instructions, but they could not break all the codes or predict when activation would occur. The constant stream of messages kept German security forces on edge, uncertain of when the hammer would fall. By early June 1944, Allied intelligence had assembled a comprehensive picture of the Normandy defenses. They knew the location of almost every bunker, the caliber of almost every gun, and the approximate strength of almost every German unit. They knew the tides, the beaches, the roads leading inland. This knowledge was not perfect. War never allows for perfection, but it was extensive enough to plan the assault with confidence. The men and women who provided this intelligence did so at great personal risk. Many would not survive to see liberation. Their contribution was often invisible, their names unknown to the soldiers who benefited from their bravery. But without their eyes and ears on the occupied coast, Overlord might never have succeeded. The photographs were studied, the messages were decoded, the sabotage teams prepared. The invisible army of intelligence and resistance stood ready to play its part in the coming battle. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived in France in November 1943 with a reputation forged in the deserts of North Africa. Known as the Desert Fox, Rommel had achieved fame for his aggressive tactics and rapid maneuver warfare. Now he faced a different challenge, defending a coastline against an invasion force of unknown size, at an unknown time, at an unknown location. His appointment to command Army Group B, responsible for the coastal defenses from the Netherlands to the Loire River, marked a shift in German strategy. The Atlantic Wall would be tested, and Rommel was determined to make it impregnable. From the moment he took command, Rommel drove his forces relentlessly. He toured the coastal fortifications personally, inspecting bunkers, questioning commanders and noting deficiencies. What he found did not satisfy him. The Atlantic Wall, for all the propaganda surrounding it, was incomplete and uneven. Some sectors were heavily fortified, others had little more than barbed wire and scattered gun positions. The workforce was insufficient, materials were scarce. Years of war on multiple fronts had drained German resources. Rommel's philosophy of defense differed fundamentally from that of his superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. Rundstedt, an old-school Prussian strategist, believed in holding strong armored reserves inland. When the Allies landed, these reserves would counterattack and drive them back into the sea. The decisive battle would be fought away from the beaches, where German mobility and tactical skill could be brought to bear. Rommel disagreed vehemently. He had witnessed the devastating effectiveness of Allied air power in North Africa and Sicily. Any armored reserve moving by daylight would be subjected to relentless air attack. Roads would be cratered, columns would be strafed, tanks would be destroyed before reaching the battle. The only way to defeat the invasion, Rommel argued, was to stop it at the waterline. The first 24 hours would be decisive. If the Allies established a foothold, German forces would be unable to dislodge them. With this conviction, Rommel threw his energy into strengthening the beach defenses. He ordered millions of mines laid along the beaches, in the fields behind, and on the roads leading inland. Estimates suggest that by June 1944, the Germans had planted over 4 million mines in the Normandy region alone, though Rommel wanted many times that number. On the beaches themselves, Rommel directed the placement of elaborate obstacles designed to destroy landing craft. Steel hedgehogs, made from crossed girders, would rip hulls open. Wooden stakes topped with mines would explode on contact. Concrete tetrahedrons would stop tanks. These obstacles were positioned at various points in the tidal zone, ensuring that whether the Allies landed at high tide or low, they would face a gauntlet of destruction. Inland, Rommel addressed the threat of airborne assault. Open fields, suitable for glider landings, were studded with wooden poles. Rommel's spargel, or Rommel's asparagus, the troops called them. These stakes, connected by wires and sometimes tipped with explosives, would destroy gliders attempting to land. Flooded areas were expanded by damming streams and rivers, creating impassable marshes that would trap paratroopers. The human dimension of this defense was equally critical. Rommel reorganized units, bringing stronger divisions closer to the coast and positioning them to respond quickly to landings. He demanded that every soldier understand the importance of the coming battle. There would be no strategic retreat, no trading space for time. The invasion had to be crushed immediately. Yet Rommel faced constraints beyond his control. The most critical was the disposition of the panzer reserves. The armored divisions stationed in France represented the most powerful striking force available. Rommel wanted them positioned close to Bad, the coast, able to counterattack within hours of the landing. But these divisions were under OKW, the German Armed Forces High Command, meaning Hitler himself, not Army Group B. Rundstedt and Rommel could request their movement, but Hitler had to approve any deployment. This arrangement proved disastrous. On D-Day, when the armored divisions were desperately needed in Normandy, precious hours were lost awaiting Hitler's authorization. The Führer was asleep when the landings began, and his staff hesitated to wake him. By the time orders were issued, Allied air power made daylight movements suicidal. The counterattack that Rommel had envisioned never materialized with the force necessary to drive the invaders back. There was also disagreement about where the invasion would occur. Rommel initially believed Normandy was a likely target, but intelligence and his superiors pointed to Pas-de-Calais. The deception of Operation Fortitude reinforced this misconception. Resources were divided. The 15th Army, guarding Calais, was stronger than the 7th Army in Normandy. Even within Normandy, some beaches were more heavily defended than others. As spring turned to early summer, Rommel continued his frenetic preparations. He knew time was running out. Every day brought reports of increased Allied activity across the Channel. The tension was palpable. German soldiers along the coast waited, watching the horizon, wondering when the sky would fill with aircraft and the sea with ships. Rommel himself would not be present when the invasion began. On June 4, believing that the weather made an immediate invasion unlikely, he left for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to meet with Hitler about releasing the Panzer reserves. It was a decision that would haunt him. The stakes he had planted stood ready in the fields. The mines lay buried in the sand. The guns waited in their concrete casemates. But the man who had driven these preparations with such urgency was absent when the test finally came. The Atlantic Wall was as strong as Rommel could make it. Whether it would be strong enough remained to be seen. The invasion of Normandy depended on factors beyond human control. Tides, moon phases, and weather conditions all had to align for Overlord to succeed. The requirements were precise, and the window of opportunity was narrow. In late May and early June 1944, the weather over the English Channel became the most important variable in the war. The planners had identified specific conditions necessary for the assault. The naval forces required a low tide at dawn so that beach obstacles would be visible and could be cleared by demolition teams. The tide needed to be rising so that successive waves of landing craft could reach shore without grounding too far out. The airborne forces required moonlight for navigation during their night drops. These factors pointed to a few days each month when conditions would be favorable. In June 1944, those days were the 5th, 6th, and 7th, but tides and moon phases could be calculated. Weather could not. And, as the target date of June 5 approached, the weather over the North Atlantic deteriorated dramatically. Group Captain James Stagg, a Scottish meteorologist serving as Eisenhower's chief weather advisor, found himself in an unenviable position. His forecasts would determine whether the invasion proceeded or was postponed. The responsibility weighed heavily. A wrong call could result in disaster, either launching the invasion into impossible conditions or delaying it and potentially compromising security. Stagg led a team that included meteorologists from the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, the British Meteorological Office, and the United States. These experts did not always agree. American forecasters, using different models and data, sometimes reached different conclusions than their British counterparts. Stagg had to reconcile these differing views and present a unified forecast to Eisenhower. In late May, the weather had been unseasonably good. Soldiers confined to their camps grew restless. Equipment was loaded and ready. The vast machinery of invasion was primed to move. Then, around June 1, the forecasts turned ominous. A series of low-pressure systems was moving in from the Atlantic. High winds, heavy rain, and low cloud cover were predicted for the target dates. On the evening of June 3, Eisenhower met with his commanders at Southwick House, the naval headquarters near Portsmouth. The mood was tense. Stagg presented his forecast. The weather on June 5 would be poor. High winds would make naval operations hazardous. Cloud cover would prevent aerial bombardment and close air support. The airborne drops would be compromised. Launching the invasion under such conditions risked catastrophe. The discussion that followed was grave. Eisenhower consulted his senior commanders. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, commanding the air forces, emphasized the dangers of operating in bad weather. Admiral Ramsey, commanding the naval forces, warned of the risks to the fleet. General Montgomery, commanding the ground forces, expressed confidence that his troops could succeed regardless of weather. Eisenhower faced a brutal choice. Postponing the invasion would be logistically nightmarish. Troops already loaded on ships would have to be disembarked. Morale would suffer. Most critically, secrecy might be compromised. But launching into impossible weather could turn the landing beaches into slaughterhouses. At 4:15 on the morning of June 4, Eisenhower made his decision. The invasion scheduled for June 5 was postponed by 24 hours. The order went out immediately. Ships already at sea were recalled. The vast enterprise paused, waiting for better weather. The next 24 hours were agonizing. Stagg and his team monitored every scrap of data. Weather ships in the Atlantic reported conditions. High-altitude flights gathered information. The meteorologists debated, calculated, and worried. Then, on the evening of June 4, Stagg brought unexpected news. His team had identified a brief break in the weather. A ridge of high pressure was moving in, creating a window of improved conditions beginning late on June 5 and lasting through June 6. The window was narrow, perhaps 36 hours, but it existed. Winds would moderate. Cloud cover would thin. It would not be ideal conditions, but it would be manageable. Eisenhower convened another meeting at 21:30 on June 4. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Stagg presented his forecast, acknowledging the uncertainties, but expressing cautious confidence in the brief improvement. The commanders weighed in. Opinions varied. The risks were enormous either way. If Eisenhower postponed again, the next favorable tide and moon combination would not occur until June 19. 2 more weeks of waiting. 2 more weeks for security to leak. 2 more weeks for German defenses to strengthen. And what if the weather was bad on June 19 as well? The invasion might have to be delayed until July, with potentially catastrophic consequences for Allied strategy. The room fell silent as Eisenhower considered. The weight of the decision was his alone. Minutes passed. Then, quietly but firmly, he spoke. "I am quite positive that the order must be given." The invasion was on for June 6, 1944. At 4:15 on June 5, Eisenhower convened one final meeting to confirm the decision. Stagg reported that the weather prediction held. The brief improvement was coming. Eisenhower looked around the room, then gave the final order. "Okay, let's go." Across southern England, the machinery of invasion roared to life. Ships weighed anchor and moved into the channel. Aircraft were fueled and armed. Paratroopers boarded their transports. The greatest military operation in history was underway. The Germans, lacking the sophisticated weather forecasting capabilities of the Allies, were caught off guard. Their meteorologists, working with less data from fewer sources, predicted that the poor weather would continue. Rommel, as mentioned, had left for Germany. Other senior commanders had departed for a war game in Rennes. The German defenses relaxed slightly, believing that no invasion would come in such conditions. This miscalculation gave the Allies a crucial advantage. When the first reports of parachute drops reached German headquarters late on June 5, confusion reigned. Was this a major operation or a diversionary raid? The weather had been so poor that surely no full-scale invasion was possible. By the time the Germans realized the truth, thousands of Allied soldiers were already on French soil. The weather had opened a narrow door. Eisenhower had the courage to walk through it. The evening of June 5, 1944, descended on southern England with a mixture of anticipation and solemnity. In hundreds of airfields and ports, the final preparations for Overlord reached their culmination. Men who had trained for months, some for years, now faced the reality that they would soon be in combat. The waiting was almost over. At airfields across England, ground crews worked through the night, painting invasion stripes on aircraft. These bold bands of black and white, applied to wings and fuselages, would identify Allied planes to naval gunners and ground troops below. The memory of friendly fire incidents in Sicily, where Allied aircraft had been shot down by their own ships, demanded precautions. Every aircraft participating in Overlord fighters, bombers, transports, gliders, received the distinctive markings. The smell of paint hung heavy in the air as crews rushed to complete the task before takeoff. In the airborne camps, paratroopers attended final briefings. Sandtable models of their drop zones were studied one last time. Objectives were reviewed: bridges to capture, crossroads to hold, causeways to secure. The soldiers memorized recognition signals, metal crickets that clicked when squeezed, passwords and countersigns. In the darkness and confusion of a night drop, identifying friend from foe would be critical. The paratroopers' equipment was formidable. Each man carried his personal weapon, rifle, or submachine gun, along with ammunition, grenades, rations, and medical supplies. Many carried additional gear: demolition charges, mortar rounds, radio equipment. Fully loaded, a paratrooper could weigh over 300 pounds. Moving with such burden was exhausting, but the men bore it, knowing they might be isolated for hours or days before link-up with seaborne forces. Chaplains moved among the troops, offering prayers and words of comfort. Protestant, Catholic, Jewish. The diversity of faith reflected the diversity of the army itself. Some men knelt in prayer, others wrote final letters to loved ones. The atmosphere was subdued but determined. General Eisenhower spent the evening visiting airborne units. At one airfield, he walked among the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, speaking with individuals, asking where they were from, joking to ease tension. Photographers captured the moment Eisenhower surrounded by young men with blackened faces, their equipment bristling with weaponry. The Supreme Commander's face betrayed the strain he carried. These men were jumping into the unknown, and many would not return. The responsibility weighed on him visibly. After leaving the airfield, Eisenhower returned to his headquarters. There, alone, he drafted a message to be released if the invasion failed. It read, "Our landings in the Cherbourg Harbor area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He dated it July 5, mistakenly writing the wrong month, a sign of the stress he endured. He kept the note in his wallet, ready if needed. It would never be used. In the ports, the loading of troops onto landing craft continued through the day and into the evening. Soldiers filed aboard in orderly columns, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: fear, determination, resignation, excitement. Officers checked rosters. Equipment was secured. The ships, from massive LSTs, landing ship tank, to small LCVPs, landing craft, vehicle personnel, filled with humanity and materiel. The crossing would take hours. Many soldiers would spend the night on rough seas, battling seasickness and anxiety. The channel, despite the improving weather, remained choppy. Men who had trained for combat found themselves first fighting. Nausea. Buckets were passed. Prayers were muttered. Some tried to sleep, though few succeeded. Naval vessels took their positions. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that would provide bombardment support moved into formation. Minesweepers preceded the fleet, clearing channels through German minefields. The coordination was extraordinary, thousands of vessels moving in concert through the darkness, maintaining radio silence, navigating by careful planning and precise timing. In the air, the first aircraft began taking off as darkness fell. Pathfinders, specially trained paratroopers, tasked with marking drop zones, lifted off first. Their mission was to parachute into Normandy ahead of the main force, set up navigation beacons and lights, and guide the following waves to their targets. It was dangerous work, requiring these small teams to operate behind enemy lines with minimal support. Behind the Pathfinders came the main airborne force, C-47 transport aircraft. Their engines, roaring, taxied down runways and lifted into the night sky. Each plane carried a stick of paratroopers, typically 15 to 18 men who would jump together. The aircraft formed into vast formations, creating an aerial armada that stretched across the sky. Gliders followed. These engineless aircraft, towed by powered planes, carried heavier equipment: anti-tank guns, jeeps, additional troops. The glider pilots, knowing they had only one chance to land correctly, focused on their instruments and the tow rope ahead. Once released over Normandy, they would guide their fragile craft to Earth, ideally in open fields, realistically into whatever space they could find. As the aircraft crossed the English coast and headed out over the channel, some pilots flashed their wing lights in salute to the naval vessels below. The ships, maintaining blackout conditions, could not respond, but the gesture was noted. The air and sea forces were united in purpose. Below, on the ships, soldiers looked up at the sound of aircraft engines passing overhead. They knew that the airborne troops would be first into combat, seizing objectives that would protect the flanks of the beach landings. The men on the ships would follow at dawn. The operation was unfolding as planned. The night was dark, the moon partially obscured by clouds, enough light for navigation, not enough to make the aircraft easy targets. The wind had moderated as Stagg had predicted. The weather window was holding. As the clock moved toward midnight, the first Allied soldiers approached the coast of occupied France. The liberation of Western Europe was beginning. In homes across Britain and America, families slept unaware that their sons, husbands, and brothers were flying or sailing toward destiny. The world would wake to news that would change everything. The engines droned on. The ships plowed through the waves. And ahead, in the darkness, Normandy waited. The first Allied soldiers to touch French soil on D-Day did not arrive by ship. They fell from the sky. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, thousands of American paratroopers descended upon the Cotentin Peninsula, their mission to secure the western flank of Utah Beach and disrupt German defenses. What followed was chaos, courage, and small unit actions that would determine the fate of the invasion's right flank. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions comprised the American Airborne Assault. Together, they numbered roughly 13,000 paratroopers and glidermen. Their objectives were specific: capture key crossroads, secure causeways leading inland from Utah Beach, destroy bridges that German reinforcements might use, and create confusion in the enemy rear. Success would protect the vulnerable beachhead from counterattack. Failure would leave the seaborne assault exposed. As the C-47 transports crossed the Norman coast, everything began to go wrong. The aircraft encountered unexpected cloud banks that forced formations to break apart. Pilots, attempting to maintain station, drifted off course. German anti-aircraft fire erupted from below, tracing lines of light through the darkness. Flak exploded around the aircraft. Some pilots took evasive action, climbing, diving, turning maneuvers that threw off the carefully planned jump timing. The paratroopers, standing in the aircraft ready to jump, felt the planes lurch. The green light came on the signal to go. Men shuffled forward and threw themselves into the night sky. The opening shock of the parachute yanked them upward. Then they were floating down through darkness, tracers streaking past, the ground invisible below. The scattering was severe. Instead of landing in concentrated drop zones, the paratroopers were spread across an area of hundreds of square miles. Some landed miles from their intended positions. Others descended into flooded areas, fields that Rommel had ordered inundated as defensive measures. The water, waist-deep in some places, concealed ditches and channels that could be deeper. Men, weighted down by their heavy equipment, drowned in the darkness, unable to free themselves from parachute harnesses or find solid ground. Private John Steele of the 82nd Airborne had his parachute snag on the church steeple in the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. He hung there for 2 hours, playing dead while the battle raged below, before being taken prisoner by the Germans. He later escaped and rejoined American forces. His experience, both harrowing and improbable, symbolized the scattered and confused nature of the airborne assault. In Sainte-Mère-Église itself, the 82nd Airborne's drop coincided with a building fire that had brought townspeople and German soldiers into the streets. Paratroopers descended directly into the illuminated square. Some shot before they reached the ground, yet the division rallied. Small groups of men, finding each other in the darkness, using cricket clickers and passwords, formed ad hoc units. Officers gathered whoever they could find and moved toward objectives. The 101st Airborne faced similar dispersion. Their targets included the causeways behind Utah Beach elevated roads, crossing the flooded areas that the beach assault forces would need to advance inland. Without these causeways secured, the troops landing at Utah could be trapped on the beach. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole gathered a mixed group of paratroopers and led them toward the causeways. The men came from different units, their cohesion forged in the moment rather than training. They moved through the darkness, engaging German positions, clearing farmhouses, and advancing toward their objectives. Cole would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions in Normandy, though he would be killed before the campaign ended. The confusion that plagued the airborne troops also affected the Germans. Reports flooded into German headquarters of parachutists landing across the entire Cotentin. The scattered nature of the drop made it impossible for the Germans to determine the size or intent of the assault. Were these the main invasion forces or diversionary raids? The uncertainty paralyzed decision-making. German commanders hesitated to commit reserves without understanding the situation. Rommel was in Germany. Other senior officers were away. The chain of command, complicated by Hitler's insistence on controlling armored reserves, meant that crucial hours passed without coordinated response. As dawn approached, the American airborne divisions had suffered heavy casualties and had not achieved all their objectives. Yet they had succeeded in the most important sense. They had disrupted German communications, confused the enemy command structure, and secured enough key positions to protect the Utah Beach landings. Small groups of paratroopers held crossroads, blocked bridges, and tied down German units that might otherwise have counterattacked the beaches. The statistics were sobering. Of the 13,000 American paratroopers who jumped that night, roughly 2,500 were killed, wounded, or captured in the first hours. Equipment losses were equally severe. Many of the bundles containing heavy weapons, radios, and ammunition were lost in the drop, landing in flooded fields or enemy-held territory. Yet the mission succeeded. The causeways behind Utah Beach fell into American hands. German reinforcements, moving toward the beach, encountered American paratroopers blocking their path. The chaos that had seemed disastrous in the night had its own military value. The Germans could not mass forces against scattered enemies they could not locate or predict. The paratroopers who survived that first night dug in. They knew that relief would come from the beaches they had, only to hold until the seaborne forces linked up with them. Some would wait hours, others days. They held their positions with determination born of training and desperation. As the sky began to lighten in the east, the first sounds of naval bombardment rolled across the fields. The beach assault was beginning. The airborne soldiers had done their job. Now, it was up to their comrades arriving from the sea. On the eastern flank of the Normandy invasion, British airborne forces executed what would become one of the most celebrated operations of D-Day. Their objectives were critical: capture intact the bridges over the Orne River and Caen Canal, destroy other bridges to prevent German counterattacks, and neutralize the Merville battery that threatened Sword Beach. The precision and bravery displayed in these operations became legend. The 6th Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Richard Gale, was tasked with securing the left flank of the invasion. Their area of operations lay east of the landing beaches, between the sea and the city of Caen. The most crucial objectives were 2 bridges, one over the Caen Canal and one over the Orne River near the village of Bénouville. These bridges had to be captured intact before the Germans could destroy them, as they would be vital for reinforcements moving inland from Sword Beach. The mission to capture these bridges was assigned to a glider force led by Major John Howard. 6 Horsa gliders, each carrying roughly 28 men, would land as close to the bridges as possible in the darkness. The operation demanded extraordinary skill from the pilots. They had to release from their tow aircraft at the correct altitude and position, then glide silently through the night to land within yards of the objective. Too far away, and the Germans would have time to demolish the bridges. Too close, and the gliders might crash into the water. At 0:16 on June 6, 1944, the first glider touched down just 47 yards from the Caen Canal Bridge. The wooden aircraft slammed into the ground, its undercarriage tearing away as it skidded to a halt. The men inside, dazed by the impact, scrambled out and charged toward the bridge. Within minutes, they had overwhelmed the small German garrison. The bridge was captured intact. The 2nd and 3rd gliders landed nearby, their troops reinforcing the position. At the Orne River Bridge, the remaining 3 gliders landed close to target, and that bridge too was quickly seized. The Germans, taken completely by surprise, had no chance to detonate the demolition charges already in place. Major Howard's men now faced the task of holding these bridges until relieved by seaborne forces. They expected counterattacks, and they came. German units probed the British positions throughout the night and into the morning. The airborne soldiers, lightly armed compared to regular infantry, repelled each assault. Casualties mounted, but the bridges held. The Caen Canal Bridge would later be renamed Pegasus Bridge, after the winged horse emblem of British airborne forces. It became a symbol of daring and precision in military operations. While Howard's men held their prize, other elements of the 6th Airborne were engaged in equally critical missions. The 9th Parachute Battalion was tasked with destroying the Merville Battery, a fortification containing guns that could devastate Sword Beach. Intelligence estimated the battery housed 4 150mm guns inside a concrete casemate, protected by minefields, barbed wire, and a garrison of roughly 200 German soldiers. The battalion's plan was detailed. Pathfinders would mark the drop zone, the main force would land and assemble, specialized teams would clear paths through the minefield, and the assault would begin precisely at 4:30, timed to complete before the naval bombardment supporting the beach landing began. Almost nothing went according to plan. The Pathfinders, scattered by the drop, failed to mark the drop zone properly. When the main force jumped, they too were dispersed over a wide area. Of the 750 men who were supposed to assemble for the attack, only about 150 reached the battery on time. Equipment was lost. The specialized mine-clearing teams never arrived. Heavy weapons were missing. Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway, commanding the battalion, faced a desperate decision. The naval bombardment was scheduled to commence at 5:30. If the battery was not silenced by then, the ships might assume the mission had failed and shell the position themselves, killing any British soldiers inside. But attacking with only 150 men against a fortified position designed for 200 defenders seemed suicidal. Otway decided to attack. His men had trained for this mission. They would not fail. At 4:30, the assault began. Without proper mine-clearing equipment, the soldiers simply charged through the minefields. Explosions tore through their ranks. Men fell, screaming, but the survivors pressed on, reaching the perimeter wire and cutting through with whatever tools they had. Inside the battery, the fighting was savage. The British soldiers cleared each position with grenades and bayonets. The German defenders, surprised by the ferocity of the assault, fought back hard. Casualties were heavy on both sides. When the battle ended, the British had lost over half their assault force killed or wounded, but the battery was taken. The guns inside were not the large 150mm pieces intelligence had predicted. They were smaller 100mm Czech-made guns. Nevertheless, they could have caused serious damage to the beach assault. The British troops disabled the weapons by removing the breech blocks and departed the position, carrying their wounded. As dawn broke, the 6th Airborne Division held its key objectives. The bridges were secured. The Merville Battery was silenced. Other units had destroyed bridges over the Dives River to the east, creating a barrier against German reinforcement from that direction. The cost had been high. Many paratroopers were killed, wounded, or scattered beyond recovery, but they had accomplished what they set out to do. The eastern flank of the invasion was anchored. At 13, commandos, led by Lord Lovat, arrived at Pegasus Bridge from Sword Beach, linking up with Howard's men. Relief had come. The piper, Bill Millen, who had accompanied the commandos, played his bagpipes as they crossed the bridge, a sound that the beleaguered airborne soldiers would never forget. The bridges were held, the flank was secure, the invasion could proceed. As the airborne operations unfolded inland, the main invasion force approached the Norman coast. 5 beaches had been designated for the assault: 2 American, Utah and Omaha, and 3 British and Canadian Gold, Juno and Sword. The American landings at Utah and Omaha would prove starkly different, one relatively smooth, the other nearly catastrophic. Utah Beach, the westernmost of the invasion beaches, lay on the Cotentin Peninsula. The assault was assigned to the 4th Infantry Division, with follow-up waves from other units. The beach approach was straightforward, a long, flat stretch of sand backed by low dunes and flooded areas. The causeways the airborne troops had secured led inland across these flooded fields. The naval bombardment began before dawn. Battleships and cruisers offshore opened fire on German positions, their massive shells screaming toward the coast. The sound was tremendous, a constant rolling thunder that soldiers in the landing craft could feel in their connection chests. Rockets were launched from specialized ships, their trails of fire crossing the sky toward the beach. The intention was to destroy or suppress German defenses before the first troops landed. As the landing craft approached the beach, they encountered an unexpected situation. Strong currents and navigation errors pushed the assault waves roughly 2,000 yards south of the intended landing site. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the assistant division commander and son of the former president, was among the first senior officers ashore. Surveying the situation, he recognized that they had landed in the wrong place. The decision before him was crucial. Should they attempt to redirect following waves to the correct beach or push inland from their current position? Roosevelt chose the latter. "We'll start the war from right here," he reportedly said. It proved a fortunate decision. The landing site they had inadvertently reached was less heavily defended than the planned one. German resistance was lighter. The beach exits, though different from planned, led to the same interior. The 4th Infantry Division pushed inland with relative efficiency. Casualties at Utah were the lightest of any of the 5 beaches, roughly 200 killed and wounded out of the 23,000 men who landed that day. The division linked up with the airborne forces that had secured the causeways, and by the end of D-Day, the Utah beachhead was firmly established. The story at Omaha Beach was tragically different. This beach, located between Utah to the west and the British beaches to the east, presented natural defensive advantages that the Germans had exploited ruthlessly. The beach was a crescent of sand, roughly 4 miles long, bordered by high bluffs that rose over 100 feet. Only a few draws shallow valleys led from the beach through the bluffs to the interior. The Germans had fortified these draws heavily, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every inch of the side beach. The 352nd Infantry Division, a capable German unit, had recently reinforced the area, a change that Allied intelligence had detected too late to alter plans. The German soldiers in their bunkers and trenches had clear sightlines down to the waterline. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery were pre-registered on the beach obstacles. Any attacking force would have to cross hundreds of yards of open sand under withering fire. The assault on Omaha was assigned to the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. These were among America's best units. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, was a veteran formation that had fought in North Africa and Sicily. The 29th was less experienced, but well-trained. Both would need every ounce of their capability. The pre-landing bombardment at Omaha failed to neutralize the German defenses. The bluffs were too steep, the bunkers too well protected. Naval shells that hit the cliff face simply scattered debris. The aerial bombardment was inaccurate, with many bombs falling inland rather than on the defensive positions. When the first waves of landing craft approached the beach, the German positions were largely intact. The timing was disastrous. The landing craft arrived at low tide, as planned, so that beach obstacles would be visible. This meant the soldiers had to cross 300 to 400 yards of open beach to reach even minimal cover at the base of the bluffs. As the ramps of the landing craft dropped, German machine guns opened fire. The slaughter was immediate. Men were cut down before they could take a step onto the beach. Others jumped over the sides of the landing craft, only to drown under the weight of their equipment in the churning surf. Bodies began to pile up at the waterline. The carefully planned assault degenerated into survival, men crawling, hiding behind beach obstacles, trying simply not to die. The demolition teams tasked with clearing lanes through the beach obstacles suffered enormous casualties. Engineers were killed alongside the infantrymen they were trying to help. Of the 16 demolition teams at Omaha, only a few managed to clear partial lanes through the obstacles before losses forced them to stop. The following waves of landing craft, trying to navigate through uncleared obstacles, suffered additional losses. By mid-morning, the situation at Omaha was critical. The beach was clogged with dead and wounded. Survivors huddled behind the German obstacles that had been intended to destroy them. Officers were killed or isolated. Units were intermixed and leaderless. General Omar Bradley, commanding the landing force from his ship offshore, received fragmentary reports of disaster. He seriously considered withdrawing from Omaha and diverting follow-up forces to Utah or the British beaches. But on the beach itself, amid the carnage, acts of extraordinary leadership emerged. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment stood among his men and shouted words that would become famous. Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. Small groups of soldiers began moving. They had no formal plan, just the desperate recognition that staying on the beach meant death. Destroyers offshore, seeing the infantry pinned down, moved dangerously close to shore to provide direct fire support. Their shells slammed into the German bunkers on the bluffs. The suppressing fire gave the infantry moments to advance. Slowly, painfully, the Americans began ascending the bluffs. They climbed through barbed wire, across minefields, taking casualties with every step. But they climbed. By early afternoon, small groups had reached the top of the bluffs. German defenders, seeing themselves outflanked, began to retreat. By the end of D-Day, Omaha Beach was secure barely. The beachhead was shallow, less than a mile deep in most places. Casualties were horrific. Estimates range from 2,000 to over 4,000, killed, wounded, and missing. The beach earned its grimmer nickname, Bloody Omaha, yet the lodgment held. The Americans had paid a terrible price, but they had established themselves on French soil. The invasion at Omaha had come within hours of failure. It succeeded through the courage of individual soldiers who refused to accept defeat. The three eastern beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were assigned to British and Canadian forces. Their objectives were ambitious, not only to establish beachheads, but to push inland toward the city of Caen, a vital road and rail junction. By the end of D-Day, Caen was supposed to be in Allied hands. It would remain in German control for another month. Gold Beach, the westernmost of the three British beaches, was assaulted by the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division. The beach stretched between the villages of Arromanches and La Rivière. German defenses here were substantial but not as formidable as at Omaha. The bluffs were lower, the gradients more forgiving. The British brought specialized armor to their assault. The 79th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Percy Hobart, had developed a range of modified tanks designed to overcome specific obstacles. These were colloquially known as Hobart's funnies. Among them were flail tanks, Shermans equipped with rotating drums and chains that detonated mines ahead of the vehicle. There were tanks that carried fascines bundles of logs to fill anti-tank ditches. There were tanks that fired massive petard mortar shells to destroy bunkers. And there were the DD duplex drive tanks, Shermans fitted with flotation screens that allowed them to swim ashore, providing armored support from the first moments of the landing. The DD tanks launched from their landing craft several thousand yards offshore. Their canvas screens, raised like skirts around the hull, provided buoyancy while propellers drove them through the water. It was a precarious system. The tanks sat low in the water, vulnerable to waves and swamping. At Omaha, most of the DD tanks had sunk in the rough seas, their crews drowning inside. At the British beaches, the conditions were slightly better, and more tanks made it ashore. At Gold Beach, the specialized armor proved its worth. Flail tanks cleared paths through minefields. Petard tanks blasted holes in concrete obstacles. The infantry followed closely behind, advancing up the beach with armored support that the Americans at Omaha had largely lacked. German resistance was still fierce. Machine gun nests and strongpoints had to be cleared individually, but the combination of firepower and specialized equipment kept the assault moving. By midday, the 50th Division had pushed inland. The village of Arromanches, selected as the site for one of the Mulberry artificial harbors, was captured. Elements advanced toward Bayeux, the first major French town to be liberated. By evening, British forces were several miles inland, though still short of their most ambitious objectives. Juno Beach, assigned to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, presented its own challenges. The beach was studded with rocks and reefs that could damage landing craft. The town of Courseulles-sur-Mer sat directly on the beach, its houses fortified and incorporated into the German defensive scheme. A delay in the landing caused by tidal conditions that would have grounded craft on the offshore reefs meant the Canadians landed later than planned, after the tide had risen and covered many beach obstacles. The initial waves took heavy casualties. Landing craft struck hidden obstacles. Mines exploded. German fire raked the beach. The Regina Rifle Regiment and the Royal Winnipeg Rifles suffered significant losses in the first minutes, but the Canadians pressed forward with determination. House-to-house fighting erupted in Courseulles as the soldiers cleared German positions. DD tanks at Juno fared better than at some other beaches, with a higher percentage making it ashore. Their 75mm guns engaged German strongpoints directly, suppressing fire that would have killed more infantry. Combat engineers worked feverishly to clear obstacles and open lanes for follow-up vehicles. By afternoon, the 3rd Canadian Division had broken through the immediate beach defenses and was advancing inland. Their progress was remarkable. By day's end, the Canadians had pushed deeper inland than any other Allied force, nearly to the Combayou Highway, but the advance left them exposed, with their flanks unprotected as neighboring units had not kept pace. Sword Beach, the easternmost landing site, was assaulted by the British 3rd Infantry Division. Their ultimate objective was Caen itself. Roughly 9 miles inland, the beach lay near the mouth of the Orne River, close to where the 6th Airborne had secured the critical bridges at Bénouville. The assault at Sword benefited from the link between sea and airborne forces. Lord Lovat's commandos, landing with the first waves, were tasked with racing inland to relieve the airborne troops holding Pegasus Bridge. They accomplished this by early afternoon, establishing a continuous front from the beach to the airborne perimeter. However, the advance toward Caen stalled. The British 3rd Division encountered elements of the 21st Panzer Division, the only German armored counterattack on D-Day itself. The panzers struck late in the afternoon, attempting to drive through to the coast and split the British beachhead. The attack came dangerously close to success. German tanks reached the coast near Lyons-sur-Mer, momentarily severing the connection between Juno and Sword. But the German armor was too little, too late, and poorly coordinated. British anti-tank guns and naval gunfire took their toll. More critically, as the German tanks reached the coast, they witnessed the sight that crushed any hope of repelling the invasion. Waves of gliders carrying reinforcements for the 6th Airborne Division flew overhead, landing behind British lines. The scale of the Allied operation became undeniable. The German tank commanders, recognizing they could not hold their exposed position, withdrew. The counterattack had failed, but it had consumed precious hours. The British 3rd Division, delayed by this fighting and by congestion on ours, the beach, could not push to Caen. By nightfall, they were still 3 miles from the city. The objective that had been planned for D-Day would remain in German hands for weeks of brutal fighting. As darkness fell on June 6, 1944, the Allies assessed their situation. 5 beachheads had been established along roughly 50 miles of Norman coastline. Over 156,000 Allied troops were ashore, roughly 23,000 at Utah, 34,000 at Omaha, 25,000 at Gold, 21,000 at Juno, and 29,000 at Sword, plus the airborne forces inland. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, yet the day had not gone entirely to plan. Omaha had nearly failed. Caen remained in German hands. The beachheads, though secure, were not yet linked into a continuous front. German forces, though surprised and disorganized, were beginning to recover. The cost was significant. Allied casualties on D-Day numbered roughly 10,000 killed, wounded, and missing. The exact figure would never be known with precision. German casualties were similar, though records were incomplete given the chaos of the day. But the lodgment was established. The Germans had failed to throw the Allies back into the sea on the first day, the moment Rommel had believed would be decisive. The ships continued to arrive. Reinforcements poured ashore. Supplies accumulated on the beaches. Each hour made the Allied position stronger. The longest day was ending. The battle for Normandy was just beginning. The soldiers who had survived the beaches expected that the hard part was over. They were wrong. Inland from the Norman coast lay the bocage, a landscape of small fields enclosed by dense hedgerows that would become one of the most difficult battlegrounds of the war. For the next month, Allied forces would fight a grinding war of attrition through this terrain, suffering casualties comparable to the bloodiest battles of the First World War. The bocage was a patchwork of agricultural fields, each surrounded by hedgerows that had grown for centuries. These were not simple hedges. They were dense barriers of earth, roots, and vegetation, some rising over 6 feet high and equally thick. The earthen banks at their base had been built up over generations, creating natural fortifications. A single bocage field was typically only a few hundred yards across, bounded on all sides by these impenetrable walls. For the defenders, the bocage was ideal. Each hedgerow provided excellent cover, concealment. Machine gun teams could hide in the dense vegetation, invisible until they opened fire. Anti-tank guns could be positioned to cover the single gaps in each hedgerow, the gaps being the only way vehicles could pass through. Mortars, situated in the fields beyond, could rain shells on attackers with impunity. For the attackers, the bocage was a nightmare. Visibility was limited to the single field being crossed. Armor support, so crucial in modern warfare, was negated. Tanks could not push through the hedgerows. The dense roots and earthen banks would stall them or expose their vulnerable undersides to anti-tank fire. Each field had to be taken individually, requiring infantry to expose themselves to murderous fire. The German defenders, particularly the 352nd Infantry Division and later the paratroopers of the II Parachute Corps, were skilled in defensive warfare. They had learned from years of fighting on the Eastern Front how to make attackers pay for every inch of ground. In the bocage, they applied these lessons ruthlessly. The pattern of combat became grimly repetitive. American infantry would approach a hedgerow, receive fire from the opposite side, call for artillery or tank support, attempt to maneuver around the hedgerow, clear it with grenades and rifles, consolidate, and then face the identical situation at the next hedgerow, 50 yards away. Progress was measured in fields, not miles. A good day might see an advance of a few hundred yards. Casualties mounted relentlessly. The 29th Infantry Division, blooded at Omaha Beach, now faced equally desperate fighting in the bocage. The division's advance toward Saint-Lô, a crucial road junction, became a painful crawl. Entire battalions were decimated. Replacement soldiers arrived, were thrust into combat, and became casualties within hours. The psychological toll was immense. Men knew that each hedgerow might harbor their death. American commanders recognized that tactics and equipment designed for open warfare were failing. The standard approach infantry advancing with tank support did not work when tanks could not move through the terrain. A solution emerged from the ingenuity of frontline soldiers. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron devised a simple but effective innovation. He welded steel teeth, cut from German beach obstacles, to the front of a Sherman tank. These rhino attachments allowed the tank to drive directly into a hedgerow, cutting through the roots and earth, rather than climbing over and exposing its underside. The tank could burst through the hedgerow, surprising defenders on the opposite side and providing direct fire support for the infantry. The idea spread rapidly. Workshops behind the lines fabricated hundreds of rhino attachments. Tanks equipped with these devices transformed the tactical situation. Now armor could support infantry through the bocage, providing the firepower advantage that had been missing. Other adaptations emerged. Infantry developed techniques for clearing hedgerows systematically. Small teams would suppress enemy fire, while others maneuvered to the flanks. Artillery fire was coordinated more precisely. Air support, when weather permitted, struck German positions just ahead of the advancing troops. Yet even with these improvements, the advance remained slow and costly. The Germans fed reinforcements into the bocage, determined to contain the Allied beachhead. The elite A2 Parachute Corps, commanded by General Eugen Meindl, defended tenaciously. These were hardened veterans, fanatically dedicated to their duty, Saint-Lô became the focus of the American effort in late June and early July. This town of roughly 11,000 pre-war inhabitants sat at a crossroads that the Americans needed for their planned breakout from the beachhead. But the approaches were through more bocage, and the Germans had fortified the town extensively. The fighting for Saint-Lô was brutal. The 29th and 35th Infantry Divisions, along with other units, ground toward the town inch by inch. Villages with names like Saint-Jean-de-Dive and Martinville became killing grounds. Artillery duels devastated the landscape, the fields filled with the dead. On July 18, American forces finally entered Saint-Lô. The town was rubble. Allied bombing and artillery had destroyed most of it. The civilian population had fled or sheltered in cellars. The American flag was raised over the ruins, but the victory felt hollow. The cost had been enormous. By the time Saint-Lô fell, the American armies had suffered tens of thousands of casualties in the bocage fighting. The advance from the beaches less than 20 miles in some sectors had taken nearly 6 weeks and consumed divisions at an alarming rate. Yet the grinding battle had served a strategic purpose. The German forces defending the bocage had been bled as well. Their reserves were depleted. Their best units, paratroopers, the panzer divisions, had been worn down defending ground that ultimately could not be held. The stage was being set for a breakout that would shatter the German position in Normandy entirely. The bocage had been a school of hard lessons. The Americans who emerged from it were different soldiers than those who had landed on the beaches. They had learned to fight in the closest quarters, to adapt their tactics to unforgiving terrain, and to endure casualties that would have broken lesser armies. That hard-won experience would serve them in the battles to come. While the Americans fought through the bocage in the west, the British and Canadian forces faced their own desperate struggle in the east. Caen, the city that was supposed to fall on D-Day, remained firmly in German hands. For the next month, it would be the scene of some of the most intense fighting of the Normandy campaign, as the British launched repeated operations to capture this vital objective. Caen's importance was both practical and symbolic. The city sat at the junction of major roads and railways, making it a natural hub for reinforcements and supplies. Its airfields, if captured, could base Allied fighters closer to the front. More immediately, Caen blocked the route to the open tank country beyond terrain where Allied armoured superiority could be brought to bear. As long as Caen held, the British were bottled up in the narrow beachhead. The German defence of Caen was formidable. They had positioned their best formations here, recognizing the city's strategic value. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, composed largely of fanatical young soldiers raised in the Hitler Youth, defended the northern approaches. The 21st Panzer Division, the only German armoured unit to counterattack on D-Day, held positions around the city. The Panzerlehr Division, one of Germany's most capable armoured formations, was nearby. These units represented the cream of German armour, and they fought with skill and determination. The first major British attempt to take Caen was Operation Perch, launched in mid-June. The plan called for a pincer movement around the city, with forces advancing from the northwest and northeast. The operation began promisingly, with British armour achieving some penetration, but the Germans, reading the tactical situation quickly, counterattacked with devastating effect. At Villers-Bocage on June 13, a single Tiger tank commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann ambushed a column of the British 7th Armoured Division. In a matter of minutes, Wittmann's tank destroyed or disabled over a dozen British vehicles, including several Cromwell tanks. The action demonstrated the superiority of German heavy armour in direct engagements and shocked British commanders. Operation Perch stalled without achieving its objectives. Caen remained in German hands. Montgomery, commanding the ground forces, came under increasing pressure to deliver results. The Americans were bogged down in the bocage. The British were blocked by Caen. The campaign seemed to be stagnating. Operation Epsom followed in late June. This was a more ambitious effort, involving the newly arrived 8th Corps. The plan called for an advance across the Odon River southwest of Caen, threatening to encircle the city from the west. Success would force the Germans either to abandon Caen or risk being cut off. The attack began on June 26, following a massive artillery bombardment. British infantry and armor pushed forward through fierce resistance. The weather turned foul, with rain and low clouds limiting air support. German artillery was murderously accurate, and their infantry fought from prepared positions. The 15th Scottish Infantry Division spearheaded the assault, their progress measured in hundreds of yards and paid for in blood. Villages changed hands multiple times. Tank battles erupted in the narrow lanes and orchards. The Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tanks were employed against German strongpoints, their jets of fire terrifying defenders into submission or death. After several days of brutal combat, the British captured Hill 112, a commanding elevation southwest of Caen. From this position, they could observe the city and threaten the German flank. But holding the hill proved as difficult as capturing it. The Germans counterattacked repeatedly, committing elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, newly arrived from the Eastern Front. Operation Epsom was called off without fully achieving its objectives. Hill 112 remained contested, changing hands multiple times in subsequent weeks. The British had not broken through to Caen, yet the operation had succeeded in a larger sense. It had drawn German armored reserves to the eastern sector, away from the American front. The panzer divisions that might have crushed the American advance through the bocage were instead locked in combat around Caen. Montgomery faced criticism for the slow progress. American commanders, particularly General Omar Bradley, grew frustrated. The Allied press questioned whether the campaign was stalling, but Montgomery maintained that his strategy was working. By fixing German armor in the east, he was creating the conditions for an American breakout in the west. The attritional battles around Caen were serving the larger strategic purpose. In early July, the British launched Operation Charnwood, aimed at capturing at least the northern part of Caen. The operation was preceded by a controversial decision. The RAF bomber command would strike the city itself. On the evening of July 7, 467 heavy bombers dropped over 2,500 tons of bombs on Caen. The city was devastated. Ancient buildings crumbled. Fires swept through entire neighborhoods. The bombing was intended to disrupt German defenses and create rubble that would block their movements. In practice, it also killed hundreds of French civilians who had remained in the city. The rubble did impede German reinforcement, but also made British advance more difficult, as tanks struggled to navigate the destroyed streets. On July 8, British and Canadian forces advanced into northern Caen. The fighting was house to house, room to room. German troops defended from the ruins, their positions nearly impossible to detect until they opened fire. Snipers haunted the rubble. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Progress was measured in buildings, not blocks. The 3rd British Infantry Division and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, both veterans of D-Day, bore the brunt of the fighting. Their casualties were severe. Young men who had survived the beaches died in the shattered streets of a French city they had come to liberate. By July 9, the British and Canadians held northern Caen up to the line of the Orne River, but the southern part of the city, including the vital suburbs and surrounding high ground, remained in German hands. The operation had achieved a partial victory at heavy cost, both to the soldiers and to the civilian population, whose city lay in ruins. The struggle for Caen would continue, but the operations Perch, Epsom, Charnwood had served their strategic purpose. The German armored reserves, committed piecemeal to defend the city, were being ground down. The Allies could absorb these casualties. The Germans could not. The balance was shifting, even if slowly. By mid-July, the Allied position in Normandy had become frustrating to observers. 6 weeks after D-Day, the beachhead remained relatively shallow. Caen was only partially captured. The Americans were still fighting through the bocage. Critics questioned whether the campaign was succeeding or whether it had become another Western Front stalemate. Montgomery planned a massive operation that would shatter these perceptions. Operation Goodwood would be the largest British armoured attack of the war. employing 3 armored divisions in a single thrust east of Caen. The objective was to capture the high ground beyond the city and finally break into the open country suitable for mobile warfare. The plan was ambitious. The 3 armored divisions of 8th Corps, the Guards Armored Division, the 11th Armored Division, and the 7th Armored Division, would advance in succession through a narrow corridor east of Caen. The attack would be preceded by the heaviest aerial bombardment ever, employed in support of ground troops. Over 2,000 Allied aircraft would drop thousands of tons of bombs on German positions, theoretically annihilating the defenses before the tanks even began moving. The aerial bombardment commenced on the morning of July 18. The ground shook. Soldiers miles away felt the tremors. The target areas, villages, and defensive positions south of Caen were obliterated. German soldiers caught in the bombing were killed, stunned, or buried alive. Entire units ceased to exist. The power unleashed seemed irresistible. Following the bombing, the British armored columns began their advance. The 11th Armored Division led, its Cromwell and Sherman tanks moving through the smoky landscape. Initially, progress was good. The German defenses immediately south of the bombing zone were shattered. Prisoners, dazed and demoralized, surrendered in groups. But the German defensive system was deeper than anticipated. The bombing, for all its awesome power, had not destroyed the second and third lines of defense. Anti-tank guns, positioned on ridges and in villages beyond the bombing zone, remained intact. As the British tanks pushed forward, they entered kill zones. The village of Cagny became a graveyard for British armor. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding elements of the 21st Panzer Division, had positioned 88mm anti-tank guns with devastating effect. As the British tanks crested ridges or emerged from cover, the German guns opened fire at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The 88mm was capable of destroying any Allied tank at these distances. British tankers watched helplessly as comrades' vehicles brewed up the crew's slang for tanks catching fire. The 11th Armored Division suffered heavily. Tank after tank was knocked out. Crews bailed out of burning vehicles, only to be caught by machine gun fire or mortar shells. The advance slowed, then stalled. The armored formations, trained for mobile warfare, found themselves in a shooting gallery. The Guards Armored Division, following the 11th, encountered similar problems. Their advance was channeled by the terrain villages, railway embankments, and wooded areas confined their movement. The tanks could not spread out and maneuver. They had to advance along predictable routes, where German anti-tank guns waited. Thunder began to rumble overhead as the weather deteriorated. Afternoon rainstorms swept across the battlefield, turning the ground to mud and preventing close air support. The tanks, already taking heavy losses, now lacked the aerial cover that had been promised. By the end of the first day, the British had advanced roughly 6 miles, significant distance, but well short of objectives. Over 200 tanks had been lost, destroyed, or damaged. The casualty figures were sobering. The hoped-for breakthrough had not materialized. Operation Goodwood continued for 2 more days, but momentum had been lost. German reinforcements, rushing to the threatened sector, stabilized their lines. The 1st SS Panzer Division and 12th SS Panzer Division launched counterattacks that reclaimed some lost ground. The British armored divisions, their strength depleted, could not sustain the offensive. On July 20, Montgomery called off the operation. The immediate reaction was disappointment and criticism. The press had been led to expect a decisive breakthrough. Instead, another attritional battle had consumed men and machines without achieving dramatic results. Yet Operation Goodwood's impact was significant in ways that were not immediately apparent. The operation had drawn even more German armored reserves to the eastern sector. The 1st SS Panzer Division, fresh from the Eastern Front, had been committed to stop the British advance. These units were now unavailable to counter the American operation being planned in the West. The German defensive effort was also costly. While the British had lost over 400 tanks during Goodwood and its immediate aftermath, they could replace these losses. American factories produced Sherman tanks in enormous quantities. German tank production, hampered by Allied bombing, and material shortages, could not keep pace. Each tiger or panther lost was irreplaceable. The human cost was equally imbalanced. German infantry and tank crews, fighting continuously for weeks, were exhausted. Replacements were scarce. The quality of new soldiers, hastily trained and often poorly equipped, could not match the veterans they replaced. Montgomery would later claim that Goodwood had achieved its purpose, writing down German armored strength and fixing enemy attention on the eastern sector. His critics argued that the operation had been oversold and underperformed. The debate would continue long after the war. What was undeniable was that the stage was now set for the decisive operation in the West. While the Germans focused on Caen and the British armored threat, the Americans had completed their preparations for Operation Cobra. The grinding battles through the bocage, around Caen, in the hedgerows and rubble had served their purpose. German strength was dispersed and weakened. The breakout was about to begin. The American breakout from Normandy, when it came, was sudden and devastating. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, 1944, shattered the German defensive line west of Saint-Lô and transformed the campaign from a grinding attritional struggle into a war of movement. Within days, the static front that had contained the Allied beachhead for 7 weeks collapsed entirely. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st U.S. Army, had conceived Cobra as a concentrated punch through a narrow sector of the German line. Unlike the broad front attacks that had characterized the bocage fighting, Cobra would mass overwhelming force at a single point, punch through, and then exploit the breakthrough with mobile forces. The key was concentrated firepower, specifically aerial bombardment. The target was a rectangular area approximately 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep, south of the main road running west from Saint-Lô. This sector was held by the Panzer Division, one of Germany's premier armored formations, but now depleted from weeks of continuous combat. Bradley planned to obliterate this defense with the heaviest tactical airstrike of the war. On July 24, the operation was scheduled to begin. Over 1,500 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force would saturate the target zone, followed by medium bombers and fighter bombers. The bombardment would annihilate the German positions, and American infantry and armor would advance through the breach. But July 24 became a disaster. Weather conditions were marginal, and communication between ground and air forces was flawed. The bombing run was partially executed before being called off due to poor visibility. Worse, some bombs fell short of the target zone, landing on American positions. Roughly 25 American soldiers were killed and 130 wounded by friendly fire. The attack was postponed. Bradley faced a difficult decision. The friendly fire incident had shaken confidence in the aerial plan. Some officers argued for abandoning the heavy bombardment approach entirely, but Bradley recognized that Cobra's success depended on the destruction of German defenses before the ground assault. He ordered the operation to proceed the next day, with additional safety measures. On July 25, the skies cleared. The aerial armada returned over 1,800 heavy bombers, 396 medium bombers, and 559 fighter bombers. The sight was awe-inspiring and terrifying. Soldiers on the ground looked up at formations that seemed to fill the entire sky, their droning engines creating a constant roar. The bombs fell. The target area erupted. Explosions merged into a continuous thunder. Smoke and dust rose in massive columns. The ground heaved. German soldiers in the target zone were killed, buried, or driven insane by the concussion. Tanks were overturned. Guns were destroyed. Entire units vanished. But tragedy struck again. Despite the safety measures, some bombs again fell short. This time, the casualties were even worse. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to be killed by enemy action in the war. McNair had been observing the bombardment from what was thought to be a safe distance. The bombs that killed him and over 100 other American soldiers momentarily threatened to derail the entire operation. Bradley, shaken but determined, ordered the ground attack to proceed. The infantry moved forward into the bomb-scarred landscape. What they found was devastation. German positions had been obliterated. Defenders who had survived were dazed and disorganized. Resistance, initially, was light. The Panzer-Lehr Division had been effectively destroyed as a fighting formation. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, later reported that the bombardment had annihilated his front lines. Tanks were buried or overturned. Communications were severed. The carefully prepared defensive positions were now craters and rubble. American infantry of the 7th Corps advanced through the breach. The 9th, 4th, and 30th Infantry Divisions pushed forward, encountering scattered resistance, but nothing like the organized defenses they had faced in the bocage. Behind the infantry came the armor, the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, poised to exploit any breakthrough. By the second day of Cobra, it was clear that something extraordinary was happening. The German line, which had held for weeks, was disintegrating. American armor pushed south toward Coutances, threatening to cut off German units west of the breakthrough. The enemy, recognizing the danger, began retreating. The P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers proved devastating in this phase. Armed with bombs, rockets, and machine guns, these aircraft hunted German columns retreating along the roads. Trucks, tanks, and artillery pieces were destroyed by the hundreds. The German retreat became a rout in places, with vehicles abandoned and soldiers fleeing on foot. General Patton, who had been waiting in the wings commanding the newly activated Third Army, was unleashed. His armored columns poured through the gap created by Cobra, racing south toward Avranches and Brittany. The speed of the advance was breathtaking. American tanks covered distances in hours that had taken weeks during the bocage fighting. On July 30, American forces captured Avranches, the gateway to Brittany and the route south. The seizure of this town marked the complete collapse of the German defensive line in western Normandy. The Allies had broken out of the beachhead. The strategic situation had transformed utterly. The German command, which had focused so heavily on defending Caen and the eastern sector, now faced disaster in the west. Units were scrambling to establish new defensive lines, but the American mobile forces moved too quickly. The initiative had passed decisively to the Allies. Operation Cobra's success validated the attritional strategy that had preceded it. The weeks of bocage fighting, the repeated assaults around Caen, the grinding casualties all had served to weaken and fix the German forces. When the hammer blow finally fell, the depleted and dispersed German defenses could not withstand it. The breakout began the end of the Battle of Normandy. What followed would be pursuit, encirclement, and the liberation of France. The campaign that had started on the beaches had entered its final, decisive phase. The German response to the American breakout revealed the fundamental dysfunction of their command structure. Rather than conducting a fighting withdrawal to more defensible positions, Hitler ordered a counterattack that would prove disastrous. Operation Lüttich aimed at cutting off the American armored spearheads by driving to the coast at Avranches, committed precious panzer reserves to a battle they could not win. Hitler believed that the American breakthrough could be reversed by a concentrated armored thrust. If German forces could recapture Avranches and sever Patton's supply lines, the entire American advance would collapse. The plan was bold, but ignored the realities of Allied air superiority and the depleted state of German armored forces. The operation was assigned to 4 panzer divisions: the 2nd SS Panzer Division, 1st SS Panzer Division, 2nd Panzer Division, and 116th Panzer Division. Together, these formations represented a formidable force. On paper, perhaps 250 tanks and tens of thousands of experienced soldiers. But the reality was grimmer. These divisions had been fighting continuously for weeks. Their tank strength was below establishment. Fuel and ammunition were scarce. The crews were exhausted. The attack began in the early hours of August 7, 1944, driving toward the town of Mortain. The initial assault achieved surprise. American positions around Mortain were struck by the concentrated panzer force, and some units were pushed back or surrounded. Elements of the 30th Infantry Division, occupying hills east of Mortain, found themselves cut off as German tanks swept past their positions. Hill 317, a commanding elevation overlooking Mortain, became the focal point of American resistance. Roughly 700 men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, held the hill against repeated German attacks. Surrounded and under constant fire, these soldiers called in artillery strikes on the German positions below. Their observation point gave them unobstructed views of the German forces, making their artillery direction devastatingly accurate. For 6 days, the men on Hill 317 held their position. Resupply was impossible. Artillery shells fell around them continuously. Casualties mounted. Ammunition ran low, but they held, and their artillery calls decimated the German armored columns attempting to advance toward Avranches. The German attack faltered almost immediately after its initial gains. Allied air power, unleashed as soon as morning fog lifted, fell upon the exposed panzer columns with terrifying effect. P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons attacked in wave after wave. Armed with rockets and bombs, these aircraft turned the roads into killing grounds. German tanks, their camouflage useless against aerial observation, were picked off individually. Columns ground to a halt as lead vehicles exploded, blocking the narrow roads. The Luftwaffe, promised to provide air cover for the operation, failed to materialize in significant numbers. Allied fighters swept German aircraft from the sky. The panzer crews, accustomed to at least some aerial protection in previous campaigns, found themselves utterly exposed. Tank commanders buttoned down their hatches, limiting their visibility and effectiveness. American ground forces, recovering from the initial shock, stabilized their lines. The 30th Infantry Division, reinforced by elements of other units, held firm. Artillery batteries poured shells onto German positions. Anti-tank guns, positioned on high ground, engaged the panzers at range. The German advance, which had hoped to cover over 20 miles to reach Avranches, stalled after penetrating only a few miles. General von Kluge, commanding Army Group B in Rommel's absence. Rommel had been wounded by an Allied aircraft attack on July 17, 1944, recognized the futility of the operation. He requested permission to break off the attack and withdraw. Hitler refused. The Führer, directing operations from his headquarters in East Prussia, ordered the attack to continue. More divisions were to be committed. The breakthrough to Avranches must be achieved. This order sealed the fate of the German forces in Normandy. By insisting on reinforcing failure, Hitler pushed more units into a salient that was becoming a trap. While the Germans focused their dwindling armor on the Mortain attack, American and British forces were maneuvering to encircle them. Patton's Third Army had swung south from the breakthrough, then turned east toward Le Mans and Argentan. British and Canadian forces were pushing south from Caen toward Falaise. The two pincers were closing. If they met, the German 7th Army and the Panzer divisions committed to Lüttich would be encircled. The men on Hill 317 were finally relieved on August 12, 1944. The Lost Battalion, as they became known, had suffered 300 casualties, nearly half their strength, but had held a position that disrupted the German operation fatally. Their courage and the accuracy of their artillery direction had helped break the back of the Lüttich offensive. Operation Lüttich was a catastrophic failure. The Germans lost irreplaceable tanks and experienced crews in an attack that gained nothing. More critically, the time and resources wasted on the offensive allowed the Allied encirclement to progress. The German forces, instead of retreating to new defensive lines, found themselves trapped in an ever-tightening pocket. Hitler's insistence on the counterattack reflected his declining grasp of military reality. The days of German offensive victory were long past. The material superiority of the Allies in armor, aircraft, artillery, and supplies made such operations suicidal. Yet the Führer clung to the belief that will and ideology could overcome material disadvantage. The soldiers who fought at Mortain, on both sides, knew better. They had seen the sky darken with Allied aircraft. They had witnessed the destruction of armored columns by aerial attack. They understood that the war had turned decisively against Germany. For the defenders on Hill 317 and the panzer crews in the burning tanks below, the lessons were written in blood and fire. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket was the death knell of the German 7th Army in Normandy. As American forces pushed north from Argentan and Canadian forces drove south from Caen, the jaws of an enormous trap began closing around hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. The fighting to seal this pocket and the German efforts to escape it produced some of the most intense and desperate combat of the entire campaign. The strategic situation by mid-August was clear. The German forces in Normandy, the 7th Army, and elements of the 5th Panzer Army were in danger of complete encirclement. The failed Mortain offensive had thrust them westward into a salient, while Allied forces converged from 3 directions. Escape was possible only through an increasingly narrow corridor between Argentan to the south and Falaise to the north. The Allied plan was straightforward: close the gap and trap the Germans. Patton's forces, after their spectacular sweep through Brittany and toward Les Mans, had turned north toward Argentan. The Canadian First Army, after weeks of grinding combat, was pushing south toward Falaise. If these forces could meet, the German armies would be surrounded. But closing the pocket proved more difficult than anticipated. Bradley, cautious about a collision between American and Canadian forces, and concerned about the strength of German units trying to break out, halted Patton's advance at Argentan on August 13, 1944. This controversial decision left a gap of roughly 15 miles between American and Canadian positions, enough space for German units to escape eastward. The Canadians launched Operation Tractable on August 14, 1944, to close the gap from their side. The attack employed the tactics that had proven effective throughout the campaign: massive aerial bombardment followed by armored and infantry assault. Smoke screens were deployed to blind German defenders. Tanks advanced in columns, exploiting any breach in the enemy line. Progress was measured but steady. Falaise fell on August 17, 1944, after fierce fighting. Canadian and Polish forces continued south toward the closing point of the pocket. The German defenders, knowing that their survival depended on keeping the escape route open, fought with desperate determination. Hill 262, known to the Poles as Machuga, the Mace, for its shape on maps, became the critical position. This elevation dominated the Chambois area, the last major exit route for German forces fleeing the pocket. If Allied forces controlled Hill 262, they could interdict the German escape with direct fire. The 1st Polish Armored Division, commanded by Major General Stanisław Maciek, was assigned to capture and hold Hill 262. The Poles, exiles, fighting for the liberation of their own occupied homeland, approached the task with fierce determination. Many had waited years for this moment, the chance to strike directly at the German military machine that had crushed Poland in 1939. On August 19, 1944, the Polish division fought its way to Hill 262. The terrain was difficult, the German resistance savage, but by evening, Polish soldiers stood on the crest of the hill, looking down at the roads below. What they saw was extraordinary. Thousands of German vehicles, tanks, guns, and soldiers streaming eastward in a desperate attempt to escape the pocket. The Poles opened fire. Artillery, mortars, and direct fire weapons turned the roads into slaughter zones. German vehicles exploded. Horses pulling artillery pieces fell, blocking the roads with their carcasses. Soldiers abandoned their equipment and fled on foot. The destruction was immense, but the Poles on Hill 262 were in a precarious position. They had outrun their supply lines. Ammunition was limited. German forces, desperate to keep the escape route open, launched furious counterattacks. From both inside and outside the pocket, German units assaulted the hill. The fighting was close quarters and brutal. For 2 days, August 1921, 1944, the Poles held Hill 262 against repeated attacks. Ammunition ran critically low, food was scarce, casualties mounted. At times, the Poles fought off German infantry at bayonet point. Tank battles erupted on the slopes as German armor tried to dislodge the defenders. Canadian forces attempted to link up with the Poles and reinforce their position, but German resistance slowed their advance. The Poles were largely on their own, a small force holding a vital position against overwhelming pressure. Despite the Polish heroism, the Falaise Gap was never completely sealed. German forces managed to push through the shrinking corridor, particularly during the nights when Allied air power was less effective. Estimates suggest that between 20,000 and 50,000 German soldiers escaped the pocket, though they left behind their heavy equipment. Those who did not escape faced death or capture. The scenes inside the pocket were apocalyptic. Allied aircraft attacked continuously during daylight. Artillery shells rained down. The roads became clogged with burning vehicles and dead horses. The stench of decomposing bodies, both human and animal, was overwhelming. Soldiers who experienced the Falaise pocket compared it to the most horrific images of warfare they could imagine. By August 21, 1944, the pocket was effectively closed. The surviving German forces had either escaped or surrendered. The toll was staggering. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers were killed in the pocket. Another 50,000 were captured. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Over 500 tanks and assault guns destroyed, thousands of vehicles abandoned, artillery pieces left rusting in the fields. The Polish forces on Hill 262 had suffered heavily, over 300 killed and wounded in the two-day battle. But they had accomplished their mission. Their stand had helped close the trap and had exacted a fearsome toll on the escaping Germans. The Falaise pocket marked the effective end of the German 7th Army as a fighting force. The formations that had defended Normandy so tenaciously were shattered. The road to Paris and beyond to Germany itself lay open. Eisenhower, visiting the pocket after the battle, was shaken by the carnage. He later wrote that it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The Norman countryside, peaceful for centuries, had become a charnel house. The collapse of the German position at Falaise opened the route to Paris. The French capital, occupied since June 1940, represented the political and symbolic heart of France. Its liberation would mark not only a military achievement, but a psychological turning point, the visible proof that German power was receding. As American and British forces pursued the retreating Germans eastward, the situation in Paris became increasingly volatile. The French resistance, which had operated clandestinely throughout the occupation, sensed that liberation was imminent. On August 19, 1944, resistance fighters launched an uprising within the city. Barricades were erected. German positions were attacked. The tricolor flag, hidden for 4 years, appeared on buildings throughout Paris. The German garrison commander, General Dietrich von Choltitz, faced impossible orders. Hitler, in one of his more destructive commands, ordered Paris destroyed. Bridges were to be demolished. Landmarks were to be burned. The city that had surrendered peacefully in 1940 was to be left a smoking ruin. Von Choltitz, recognizing both the futility and the criminality of such destruction, delayed implementation. He negotiated with resistance leaders, arranged local truces, and stalled for time. Whether motivated by conscience, practicality, or self-preservation, his hesitation preserved Paris from demolition. Meanwhile, Allied commanders debated whether to liberate Paris immediately or bypass it. The city, with its millions of inhabitants, would require enormous resources to feed and supply. Military logic suggested continuing the pursuit of German forces, leaving Paris to be liberated later. The city had no immediate military value, but political and humanitarian considerations prevailed. The Paris uprising placed civilians at risk of German reprisals. The symbolic importance of liberating the capital could not be ignored. General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, pressed urgently for the liberation of Paris. Eisenhower, recognizing the broader implications, authorized the advance. The French 2nd Armored Division, commanded by General Philippe Leclerc, was given the honor of leading the liberation. These were French soldiers who had fought their way from Chad in Central Africa, through North Africa, and into France itself. For them, Paris was not just a military objective, but a homecoming. On August 24, 1944, advance elements of Leclerc's division entered the outskirts of Paris. They were met with delirious joy. Crowds mobbed the tanks, kissing the soldiers, showering them with flowers and wine. The scenes were chaotic and euphoric. 4 years of occupation were ending. The following day, August 25, 1944, the liberation was complete. German forces in Paris surrendered. Von Choltitz signed the capitulation documents at the Montparnasse railway station. The tricolor flew from the Eiffel Tower. De Gaulle, arriving in the city, made his famous walk down the Champs-Élysées, surrounded by vast crowds celebrating their freedom. The joy was genuine, but not universal. Some Parisians had collaborated with the Germans. They now faced retribution. Women who had associated with German soldiers had their heads shaved publicly. Collaborators were arrested, some executed after summary trials. The liberation brought not only freedom, but reckoning. Beyond Paris, the Allied advance continued with remarkable speed. The German forces fleeing Normandy were in disarray. Units that had escaped the Falaise pocket lacked equipment and cohesion. The once formidable Wehrmacht in France was a shadow of its former strength. Allied armored columns raced toward the Seine River. One by one, major cities were liberated: Chartres, Orléans, Reims. The French population, which had endured 4 years of occupation, greeted the liberators with overwhelming emotion. Flags appeared everywhere. Church bells rang. The scientific occupation was truly ending. The Seine itself, which might have been a formidable defensive barrier, was crossed with relative ease. German demolitions had destroyed many bridges, but Allied engineers rapidly constructed replacements. The pursuit continued without pause. By the end of August 1944, the Allied forces had achieved objectives that pre-invasion planning had projected might take months. Paris was liberated. The Seine was crossed. The German armies in France were in retreat. The Battle of Normandy, which had begun with such uncertainty on the beaches of June 6, 1944, was effectively over. The strategic implications were profound. Germany's defensive position in the West had collapsed. The Allies stood on the borders of the Reich itself. The Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were also advancing, now had a counterpart in the West. Germany was being squeezed from both directions, yet challenges remained. The rapid advance had stretched Allied supply lines to the breaking point. Most supplies still came through the Normandy beaches. The great ports of France remained in German hands or were too damaged to use. The pursuit would soon outrun its logistical support, leading to new difficulties. For the moment, though, the liberation of Paris represented triumph. The city that symbolized freedom and culture had been returned to France. The Eiffel Tower, which German soldiers had climbed in 1940 as conquerors, now stood as a beacon of liberation. The occupation had ended. The Battle of Normandy was won, but the cost was staggering. The Norman countryside, with its ancient villages and pastoral landscapes, had been transformed into a wasteland. Towns that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Fields that had nurtured generations of farmers were cratered and scorched. The human toll, soldiers and civilians alike, defied comprehension. The city of Caen, which had been planned as a D-Day objective, suffered devastation comparable to the worst-hit cities of the war. Allied bombing and artillery, intended to dislodge German defenders, had destroyed approximately 75% of the city's buildings. The medieval center, with its churches and narrow streets, was largely obliterated. Over 2,000 civilians were killed in Caen during the battle. Thousands more were made homeless. Saint-Lô, the capital of ruins, as the French called it, was even more thoroughly destroyed. The town had been a key objective for the American forces, pushing through the objective, Bocage. The fighting and bombardment leveled nearly every structure. Of the pre-war population of roughly 11,000, hundreds were killed. The survivors returned to find their homes completely gone. Across Normandy, similar scenes repeated. Villages that had escaped notice for centuries became battlefields. Mortagne, Villers-Bocage, Argentan, Falaise, each name represented not only military engagements, but civilian suffering. The Norman people, whose ancestors had sailed to conquer England in 1066, now saw their land conquered by the forces of liberation. The French civilians caught in the battle faced impossible circumstances. They could not flee in all directions. German positions blocked some routes. Allied advances blocked others. Many sheltered in cellars as their homes collapsed around them. Food became scarce as supply lines broke down. Medical care was virtually non-existent for civilians in combat zones. Estimates of French civilian casualties in Normandy vary but are uniformly tragic. Conservative figures suggest over 20,000 killed during the campaign. Some estimates range higher. These were farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, children, ordinary people whose only crime was living in the path of history. The Allied casualties, while expected by military planners, were nonetheless sobering. Total Allied losses during the Normandy campaign from D-Day through the closing of the Falaise pocket approached 225,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. American casualties numbered roughly 125,000. British and Canadian losses exceeded 80,000. These figures represented not just numbers, but individual lives cut short. Young men who had crossed an ocean to fight for a cause they believed in. German casualties were equally severe, though records were less complete given the chaos of defeat. Estimates suggest over 200,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured during the Normandy fighting. The losses included some of Germany's finest formations: the elite SS, Panzer divisions, the experienced parachute troops, and the regular infantry that had defended so tenaciously. These losses could not be replaced, and their absence would be felt in the battles to come. The material destruction was immense. Thousands of tanks, vehicles, and artillery pieces lay destroyed or abandoned across Normandy. The Bocage fields were littered with the wreckage of war: helmets, rifles, equipment, the detritus of two armies locked in mortal combat. Farmers returning to their fields would find shells and mines buried in the soil for decades to come. The cemeteries began to appear even before the fighting ended. White crosses and stars of David, markers of Christian and Jewish dead, spread across the Norman landscape. The American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach, would eventually hold nearly 10,000 graves. The British and Canadian cemetery at Bayeux held thousands more. German cemeteries, less visited but equally somber, contained the remains of those who had died defending an unjust cause. The psychological toll was harder to measure but equally real. Soldiers who survived Normandy carried memories that would haunt them for lifetimes. The Bocage fighting, with its claustrophobic terror and constant casualties, left deep scars. Veterans spoke of friends lost, of moments of terror, of acts both heroic and horrifying. Many carried these memories silently, unable to share them with those who had not experienced combat. For the Norman civilians, the liberation brought relief, but not immediate recovery. Their towns were destroyed, their livelihoods ruined, their sense of safety shattered. The process of rebuilding would take years. Some villages were reconstructed in modern styles, losing their medieval character. Others attempted to restore their pre-war appearance. Either way, the Normandy that emerged from the war was different from what had existed before. Yet, amid the destruction, there were also moments of humanity. Allied soldiers shared rations with hungry civilians. Medical personnel treated wounded civilians alongside military casualties. French families sheltered soldiers, offering what little they had. The bonds formed in crisis transcended national boundaries. The Battle of Normandy was a necessary campaign, fought to liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny. Its success opened the path to Germany's defeat and the end of the war in Europe. But necessity did not diminish the cost. The price of liberation was paid in blood and suffering by soldiers and civilians alike. Military analysts studying the Normandy campaign in the years following the war drew numerous lessons about modern warfare. The campaign demonstrated the importance of air superiority, the value of intelligence, the critical role of logistics, and the challenges of coalition warfare. These lessons would influence military doctrine for decades. Air superiority proved decisive throughout the campaign. The Allied air forces, the RAF, the USAAF, and smaller contingents from other nations controlled the skies over Normandy almost completely. German aircraft appeared rarely and in small numbers. This dominance had cascading effects on every aspect of the battle. Allied ground forces could maneuver with relative freedom during daylight hours. While German movements were largely restricted to night, German armored columns attempting to reinforce Normandy were decimated by fighter-bomber attacks. The Mortain counteroffensive failed largely because Allied aircraft destroyed German tanks with impunity. The Falaise pocket became a killing ground because German forces could not move without being attacked from above. The lesson was clear. Without air superiority, ground operations in modern warfare were fatally compromised. Post-war military planning emphasized the need to achieve air control before major ground campaigns. The Normandy experience validated this principle beyond any doubt. Intelligence, particularly the signals intelligence derived from breaking German codes, shaped the entire campaign. The ULTARA program, Britain's highly secret effort to decrypt German communications, provided Allied commanders with insight into German intentions, dispositions, and weaknesses. Eisenhower and his staff knew, often in near real time, what the Germans were planning. The value of this intelligence was incalculable. Allied commanders knew when German reinforcements were moving toward Normandy. They understood German concerns about whether Normandy was the main invasion or a feint. They could anticipate counterattacks and position forces accordingly. The decision to launch Operation Cobra was influenced by intelligence indicating German weakness in the target sector. Yet Ultra had to be used carefully. If the Allies acted too precisely on the intelligence, the Germans might suspect their codes were compromised. Balancing the use of intelligence with protecting its source was a constant challenge. Success of this balancing act demonstrated the sophistication of Allied command. Logistics, the unglamorous business of supplying armies, emerged as perhaps the most critical factor in the campaign. The initial landings depended entirely on the ability to bring men, equipment, and supplies across the English Channel and onto hostile beaches. The subsequent fighting depended on maintaining the flow of ammunition, fuel, food, and replacements. The Mulberry artificial harbours, though one was destroyed by storm, proved their worth. The one at Arromanches continued operating for months, channeling supplies to the beachhead. The capture of Cherbourg, though the Germans had demolished the port facilities, eventually provided additional capacity. The German forces, in contrast, suffered constant supply problems. Allied air attacks disrupted their transportation networks. Fuel shortages immobilized tanks. Ammunition ran low at critical moments. The German material position deteriorated steadily while the Allied position strengthened. Superior logistics translated directly into combat power. Coalition warfare presented its own challenges. The Allied forces in Normandy comprised troops from numerous nations: American, British, Canadian, Polish, French, and others. Each brought different military traditions, equipment, and sometimes competing priorities. Coordinating these diverse forces required diplomatic skill alongside military competence. Montgomery's role as ground forces commander generated friction, particularly with American generals, who sometimes felt their contributions were undervalued. Patton's aggressive style clashed with more cautious British approaches. National pride influenced command decisions. Yet ultimately, the coalition held together and functioned effectively, a testament to Eisenhower's diplomatic skills and the shared commitment to defeating Nazi Germany. The campaign also demonstrated the adaptability of modern armies. When standard tactics failed in the bocage, soldiers improvised solutions, the Rhino tank attachment being a prime example. When airborne drops scattered troops across wide areas, small units formed ad hoc groups and pursued objectives. The ability to adapt and innovate under pressure proved as valuable as pre-war planning. Command decisions, particularly the willingness to accept calculated risks, shaped outcomes. Eisenhower's decision to launch the invasion despite marginal weather showed the importance of seizing opportunity. Bradley's commitment to Cobra, despite the friendly fire incidents, demonstrated persistence in the face of setbacks. Montgomery's attritional strategy around Caen, though criticized, ultimately served the broader objective. The Normandy campaign became a case study in military academies worldwide. Its lessons about combined arms operations, joint warfare, logistics, and command were studied and debated. The campaign demonstrated both the immense destructive power of modern warfare and the organizational challenges of directing it effectively. The Normandy campaign became a proving ground for military technology, particularly armored vehicles. The battles between Allied and German tanks revealed both the strengths and limitations of each side's equipment. These engagements influenced tank design and anti-tank tactics for years afterward. The German Tiger I and Tiger II tanks represented the pinnacle of heavy tank design. Armed with the deadly 88mm gun, these vehicles could destroy Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Their thick armor could defeat most Allied anti-tank weapons at normal combat ranges. In direct tank versus tank engagements, the Tiger was fearsome. The engagement at Villers-Bocage, where Michael Whitman's single Tiger destroyed numerous British vehicles, exemplified this dominance. British Cromwell and Sherman tanks found their 75mm guns ineffective against the Tiger's frontal armor. They had to maneuver to flank the German tanks or get dangerously close. Neither option was appealing in combat. But the Tiger's superiority in individual engagements did not translate to strategic advantage. The tanks were mechanically complex, prone to breakdown, and difficult to repair in the field. Their fuel consumption was enormous at a time when German fuel supplies were dwindling. Most critically, they were produced in small numbers. Throughout the war, Germany manufactured only about 1,350 Tiger I tanks. The Panther tank, Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34, was more balanced than the Tiger. With its sloped armor and powerful 75mm gun, it combined protection, firepower, and mobility reasonably well. But Panthers also suffered mechanical problems, particularly with their transmissions and final drives. In the Bocage fighting, many Panthers broke down or were abandoned after relatively minor damage. The American Sherman tank, which equipped most Allied armored units, was often criticized for its vulnerability against German tanks. Its armor was thinner, its 75mm gun less powerful. Allied tankers spoke grimly of Ronson lighters, the Sherman's tendency to catch fire when hit, igniting the ammunition stored inside. Yet the Sherman had crucial advantages that offset its weaknesses. It was mechanically reliable, able to operate for extended periods without breakdown. It was relatively easy to manufacture, and American factories produced over 49,000 Shermans during the war. When one Sherman was destroyed, another could replace it. When a Tiger broke down, replacement was problematic. The Sherman was also designed for ease of maintenance. Crews could perform many repairs themselves, keeping the tanks in action. The mechanical simplicity that made it inferior in single combat made it superior in sustained operations. In warfare, availability often mattered more than individual capability. Later model Shermans addressed some deficiencies. The Sherman Firefly, a British variant mounting the powerful 17-pounder gun, could engage German tanks more effectively. American forces eventually received Shermans with the 76mm high-velocity gun, improving anti-tank capability. These upgrades, while helpful, came too late and in too few numbers to fundamentally alter the tactical situation in Normandy. The tactical lesson that emerged was clear. Armor had to operate as part of combined arms teams. Tanks, unsupported by infantry, were vulnerable to anti-tank weapons and infantry assault. Infantry unsupported by armor was vulnerable to enemy armor and fortifications. Artillery provided suppressive fire and counter-battery capability. Aircraft added another dimension of firepower. The bocage fighting particularly illustrated this principle. Tanks alone could not penetrate the hedgerows. Infantry alone faced murderous fire crossing open fields. Together, with artillery support, they could advance slowly and at cost, but advance nonetheless. Anti-tank weapons themselves became increasingly important. The German 88mm gun, originally an anti-aircraft weapon adapted for anti-tank use, proved devastating. Its high velocity and accuracy could knock out Allied tanks at extreme ranges. Many American tankers never saw the gun that killed them. The Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck German infantry anti-tank weapons allowed single soldiers to destroy tanks. These weapons were particularly effective in the close terrain of the bocage, where tanks could not see threats until it was too late. Allied tank crews learned to fear these weapons, which could be fired from hedgerows, buildings, or any concealed position. Allied air power, particularly the fighter bombers equipped with rockets and bombs, became the greatest anti-tank weapon of the campaign. The Typhoon and P-47, circling over battlefields and hunting columns on roads, destroyed more German armor than tank-to-tank combat. The German panzer commander's greatest fear was not the enemy tank, but the aircraft overhead. The Normandy campaign demonstrated that technological superiority in individual weapons did not guarantee victory. The Germans had better tanks. They lost. The Allies had better logistics, more equipment, and air superiority. They won. Quality mattered, but quantity and availability mattered more in sustained operations. The Battle of Normandy ended in the summer of 1944, but its memory endures decades later. The Norman landscape, once churned by shells and tracked by tanks, has returned to pastoral peace. Yet the evidence of that terrible summer remains in cemeteries, museums, preserved fortifications, and the collective memory of nations. The American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer sits on a bluff overlooking Omaha Beach. Here, 9,387 American soldiers lie buried beneath white crosses and stars of David arranged in precise rows. The cemetery grounds, maintained with meticulous care by the American Battle Monuments Commission, are among the most visited sites in France. The Battle of Normandy was a military campaign, measurable in divisions, casualties, and ground gained, but it was also a human tragedy played out across a beautiful corner of France. The memory endures because the stakes were so high, the sacrifice so great, and the lessons so vital. As long as those rows of crosses stand overlooking the beaches, the story will be told and remembered. Thank you for watching the entire Battle of Normandy timeline. If this journey through history moved you, please like and share to help keep these memories alive. Until next time, remember the cost of peace and the courage of those who secured it.